Podrick Payne still remembered the days when his feet ached, his back hurt, and his hands trembled from holding up trays of wine or polishing a knight's armor. The memory lived in the corners of his mind even as he rode alongside the men he had once served. Podrick was young then, earnest, shy, ever eager to please. But no one could have guessed how steel would settle in his spine, how the whisper of determination would grow into a roar inside him. The world of Westeros had no shortage of warriors, lords, and knights proclaiming their right to glory. Podrick Payne had never boasted of anything. If he were asked, he would have said, in his modest, uncertain voice, that he had only learned to do his duty. Yet here he was, a sworn knight of the Seven Kingdoms, bound in shining plate, clutching the hilt of a sword that men had begun to fear. Even he scarcely believed the transformation that had come upon him. But war had a way of forging new shapes from old metal. He still thought about Tyrion Lannister, though. Thought of that first day in the Whispering Wood, or the moment they had parted by the banks of the Blackwater. Lord Tyrion, with all his cunning and flaws, had been something like a father figure to Podrick when his own father and uncles were absent or unimpressed. Sometimes Podrick wished Tyrion could see him now. He wished Brienne of Tarth could see him now, the tall, unwavering woman who had taken him under her wing, who had taught him the fundamentals of swordsmanship and insisted that a good heart could make a fine knight if it was tempered with discipline. And so Podrick had learned. He had learned so well he surprised himself. The road from squire to knight had not been simple. There had been no grand ceremony attended by hundreds. Instead, it came in a half-collapsed hall with a battered septon in the riverlands. A handful of men who had survived a savage skirmish and needed hope for tomorrow. A man named Ser Hyle had handed Podrick a battered blade, telling him that if he could prove himself in the fight to come, they would kneel. Podrick fought beyond his fear that evening, driving back the mercenaries of the Broken Banner until they yielded or lay still in blood-stained grass. The battered septon anointed his brow with the last of the holy oils. Rising from that ceremony, Podrick discovered there was something new in the eyes of the men around him. A kind of respect that set his cheeks ablaze with shy pride. But respect was not enough to secure peace in a land that still quaked from war after war. Of course, none of these events happened in isolation. Westeros had changed drastically since the days of King Joffrey and the War of the Five Kings. A new winter had come and gone. The Targaryens had re-emerged in flames and fury, only to fracture among themselves yet again. The Lannisters held tenuous power in the west, while the north watched, its great lords determined to preserve their newfound independence. Alliances bloomed and withered quickly. War had scarred the continent so deeply that many towns had never recovered. Some had vanished altogether. Their people either fled to the free cities or swallowed by the cold soil. The small folk hardly cared who wore the crown in King's Landing. They only cared for safety, for pockets that were not empty, and for a harvest unburned by dragonfire or bandits. Into this shifting world rode Ser Podrick Payne. He had grown, physically and in spirit, though he remained soft-spoken. He was not quite as tall as his teacher, Brienne, had been, but he stood well over 5.5 feet. Countless hours in steel plate had built muscle on his frame, though it was a lean strength rather than broad. There was an odd grace in him now, born of long training nights, of stumbling and failing in fields near a rundown castle, guided by Brienne's firm corrections. He had taken no sigil of his own yet. He wore plain steel with only a slight crest of House Payne, the purple and white parted field, the golden lion on shield and surcoat. Sometimes that reminded others that he was cousin to Island Payne, the mute king's justice of old, but he never let it define him. More often, people remembered him as squire to the imp, or the boy who had stuck by Lady Brienne when the world thought her a fool. Yet those stories were overshadowed by new murmurs, that Podrick Payne had ended the threat of the Broken Banner, had defended the battered septon from a crowd of cutthroats, had stood his ground in the face of mercenary spears. He seemed an unlikely hero, but the rumors grew. Warriors in taverns told the tale of the meek boy turned unstoppable knight. On a warm afternoon by the Mander, Podrick found himself at the head of a ragtag group of soldiers, most of whom he had never met until a few days prior. They were militia from a cluster of villages. Their rightful lord had abandoned them, off to the capital to curry favor with whichever faction held power. Bandits prowled the roads, and the locals had few defenders. They had pressed up the winding road along the Mander's banks, hoping to find and dislodge a robber knight who styled himself Ser Allwood, though his knighthood was questionable at best. Word had spread that Ser Allwood extorted travelers for coin and left them to starve when winter's chill arrived. Now that the days were warm, he roamed the roads with boldness once more. The militiamen were not precisely loyal to Podrick. Rather, they believed he was their only hope. He had stumbled upon a woman and her 2 children on the roadside, pinned by Ser Allwood's men. Podrick had stepped in, though he was alone. He unhorsed one bandit, sliced the hamstring of another, then loomed in front of the mother and children with his shield raised. The bandits scattered, uncertain of the single knight's skill. After the family told their story in the nearest village, the men there had decided they could endure no longer. They found Podrick in the local inn, asked for his leadership, and bowed their heads. It felt strange to Podrick that they trusted him so fully. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like the same Podrick who was sure to spill wine in a lord's lap if he wasn't careful. Yet he couldn't refuse. The day was bright. Their battered ranks walked across a meadow edged by tall grass. Overhead, a hawk circled once, then vanished behind a stand of oaks. Podrick wore a thin sheen of sweat under his armor. He knew they were close to Ser Allwood's holdfast. The men around him muttered quietly, clutching spears and scavenged axes. Podrick felt their nerves in the air. Fear was a real thing, a real companion. He had learned to live with it, to let it sharpen his senses. Yet the thought that these men's lives depended on him nearly crippled his courage. They reached the low hill, cresting it to see the holdfast below. A crooked tower of stone, half in ruins. A wide, rough palisade circled the grounds. 2 men stood outside, leaning on spears, more like tired farmhands than dedicated guards. Podrick drew his sword, the one from the battered Septon ceremony, and caught a glimmer of sun on steel. His heart thumped in his chest. "For your homes," he said softly to the men behind him, turning just enough to catch their eyes. "For your families." No grand speech. Podrick was no orator, but something in his voice rang true. His sincerity was a palpable thing. They nodded, lips pressed tight with determination, and followed him as he led them forward. The air filled with the crunch of dirt underfoot. The guard on the left noticed them first and straightened in alarm. "Ho there!" he yelled. "No closer or—" But Podrick cut off the warning with a swift, downward strike that battered the spear aside. The man stumbled, tried to recover, but the second guard was already fending off the spear thrust of a farmer at Podrick's side. Podrick pivoted neatly, shield raised, striking the man's helm with the boss of his shield, sending him reeling into the dust. The men behind Podrick surged through the gate. A clamor erupted inside the palisade, shouts echoing against old stone. Near the collapsed side of the tower, a cluster of bandits scrambled for their swords, their panic evident. Podrick saw them, took in their positions, and steeled himself to hold the line. The militia lacked discipline. They would break if the bandits rallied in unison. "Stay close. Keep your shields up," Podrick shouted, though half the men bore no shields at all. Ser Allwood appeared from behind a half-crumbled wall, sporting dented plate and a sneer. He was a balding man, his mouth twisted in perpetual disdain. The battered breastplate he wore once might have carried a sigil, but it was scratched beyond recognition. He pointed a long sword toward Podrick. "So the sheep find themselves a shepherd," Allwood spat. "You'll regret crossing this threshold, boy." He lunged, surprisingly quick. Podrick barely had time to parry and step aside. There was power in Allwood's blow, but Podrick sensed a lack of refinement. They exchanged 3 swift strikes, Podrick's controlled, Allwood's fueled by raw aggression. Sparks flew as steel clashed. Meanwhile, the bandits advanced on the nervous militia, and a ragged melee began. Podrick glimpsed a farmer knocked backward by a spiked mace. Another man screamed, clutching a slashed arm. Podrick's mouth went dry. He had to end Allwood fast. He feinted high, then dropped low, forcing the bandit knight to shift his stance. Podrick shoved hard with his shield, hooking Allwood's sword arm with a sharp twist of his own blade. Allwood's sword clattered to the ground, and Podrick slammed him in the ribs. The older man gasped, stumbling back. Podrick wrenched him onto his knees, panting, but he kept his sword pointed, tipped near Allwood's throat. "Surrender," Podrick commanded. His voice shook, but the command was there. "Call off your men." Allwood looked up with hate in his eyes. "You think you can do better? This land is a pit of despair. A kind soul doesn't last in these times." Podrick swallowed. "Call them off." Ser Allwood sneered, gave a short, bitter laugh, and then spat blood at Podrick's feet. "Do as you will," he growled. "I've no illusions left." Podrick caught the movement in Allwood's hand too late. The man had a hidden dagger. He lashed out wildly, aiming for Podrick's side. But Podrick's training took over. He twisted away, then drove his blade forward with a final, merciful thrust. Allwood's eyes widened and he collapsed. When Podrick pulled his sword free, the man's body slumped heavily to the dry earth. In the swirl of battle around them, the bandits saw their leader fall. Fear flickered across their faces. Podrick raised his bloodied sword high. "Throw down your weapons," he shouted, in a voice surprisingly strong. "No man needs to die if he yields." Some of the militia took up the cry. The bandits, seeing themselves outnumbered, threw down swords and clubs, dropping to their knees or fleeing out the broken gaps in the palisade. The clangor of steel subsided to trembling echoes. Panting men looked around at the dead and injured in a haze. Podrick lowered his sword slowly, his shoulders aching under the weight of armor and the burden of what he had done. In the hush that followed, the militia realized their victory. Tears slid down grimy cheeks. A wounded man groaned. Somewhere a crow squawked. Podrick knelt beside a fallen farmer, pressing a hand to staunch the bleeding of a leg wound. "We'll get you patched up," he said softly. "You fought bravely." The man hissed in pain, but nodded. Podrick called for bandages, and a younger militiaman came running with bits of torn cloth. Before nightfall, Ser Allwood's holdfast was theirs. It was a ruin of a place hardly worth calling a castle, but it served as a vantage point. The militia hauled out crates of stolen goods, sacks of grain that Allwood had pilfered from caravans. The mothers of the village wept for joy to see the supplies returned. A small cluster of bandits who had surrendered were bound together, their fate to be decided. Podrick spent much of the evening aiding the wounded, changing bandages, ensuring that no one bled out in the night. When all was calm, a few of the men approached Podrick shyly. "Ser Podrick," they began, shifting on their feet. We've no lord to protect us. We'd be honored if you stayed. We can't pay you much, but if you take a keep in the region." They trailed off. Podrick looked at their hopeful eyes. He realized they were desperate for any bulwark against the chaos outside. A large part of him wished he could remain, that he could oversee the daily tasks of protecting these decent folk, seeing them rebuild. But there were rumors of new dangers looming across the land, of warlords rising in the Westerlands, of old houses regrouping. And something called to him, some sense of responsibility that would not let him rest in one corner of Westeros. He wanted to be worthy of his vow, to protect the innocent. That vow was larger than one village. He thanked them for their offer and gently refused. In the days that followed, he helped establish the foundation of a new watch. He left them with instructions on how to rotate patrols and some measure of understanding to keep roads safe. When he finally said farewell, a crowd lined the edge of the palisade, cheering softly, calling him a hero. He blushed until his cheeks burned. He only said, "I am no hero, but you are good people. Keep each other safe." Then he rode away beneath the wide sky, alone once again. He traveled toward the Trident. Rumor claimed that conflict was brewing there. Houses who had fought for the Targaryens in the last war were forced to cede lands to new lords. The small folk who lived along the river were caught in the crossfire of disputes over new borders. Podrick thought that perhaps there he could make a difference. The road took him through fields yellowed by summer sun, past ghost towns that had never recovered from previous conflicts. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, he wondered if Westeros would ever know lasting peace. Each time, he clenched his jaw and reminded himself, men like him had to at least try. The realm was a large place. Even a single night could be a flicker of hope. His journey crossed paths with traveling merchants, minstrels who sang of noble battles long forgotten, and once or twice with minor lords riding in retinues that eyed Podrick suspiciously. He was used to such scrutiny by now. Alone nights were an oddity, especially a young one without a well-known sigil. Often, Podrick would be stopped, asked his intentions, and permitted to continue once it was clear he meant no harm. One evening, as the sun was sinking behind rolling hills, Podrick camped by a stream. He removed his breastplate and mail, letting his shoulders breathe. He washed quickly in the cool water. A hush had fallen, the wind gentle through tall grasses. In the quiet, Podrick thought of Brienne again, remembered her stern yet kind instructions about cleaning gear and caring for one's blade. He did so with deliberate care, wiping down the steel until it shone with a subdued gleam in the light of his small campfire. He thought perhaps he should have a name for his sword, as so many knights did, but he felt silly naming it. To him, it was a tool, important, yes, but not some mythic object. He patted the hilt gently before resting it in easy reach. He was just drifting to sleep when he heard hooves, the crack of twigs. He rolled onto his knees, sword in hand. A figure on horseback emerged from the shadows. Podrick caught the glint of moonlight on metal. His heart thumped in his chest. But then a voice, low and familiar, filled the air. "Easy there, squire," it teased. "I mean no harm." Podrick's breath caught. "Ser Bronn," he whispered. He could scarcely believe it. The rider dismounted with a weary grunt, but the insolent grin was the same as ever. Bronn, now lord of somewhere or other, Podrick recalled, stood with hands raised in a show of peace. He wore a black cloak, a coat of ringmail beneath, and carried a sword at his hip that Podrick knew Bronn would use without hesitation. He was older, lines etched into his face, but still sharp-eyed and cocky. "Didn't expect to see a familiar face out here," Bronn said. He glanced at Podrick's gear. "Heard rumors about some Knight Payne cutting down bandits in the Mander Valley. Figured that might just be you, seeing as I know no other Payne with a sense of decency." Podrick blinked, still startled, then sheathed his sword. "What brings you here?" he asked softly. "It's good to see you, my lord, or sire." "I'm sorry if I have the titles." Bronn waved a hand dismissively. "Don't bother. Titles come and go. At one point, I was Lord of Highgarden, if you can believe that. Not that it lasted. Maybe it still does, in a sense, but the region is in chaos. So here I am, wandering about, trying not to get my head chopped off by whichever new pretender claims to be the rightful liege. Times don't change that much, do they?" Podrick offered the seat by the fire, rummaging in his saddlebag for dried meat. Bronn took a piece, chomping on it hungrily. "They say you've made a name for yourself," Bronn added, chewing noisily. "Ser Podrick Payne, sworn knight, righteous defender of the small folk. And I thought I'd seen it all." Podrick ducked his head. Sheepish. "I only do what I can. The realm's still hurting, and it's my duty." Bronn smirked. "You sound like that big wench, Brienne. She filled your head with all that knightly nonsense, I see. Good. Suits you." They talked late into the night. Bronn told him of how the Iron Bank had pulled support from certain factions, how House Greyjoy was stirring again in the west. He mentioned rumors of Cersei Lannister's final downfall. Some said she rotted in a cell in the Red Keep. Others claimed she had died. Yet others whispered she had fled across the sea. Podrick knew better than to trust half the gossip. But it was clear that Westeros was once more on a knife's edge. He told Bronn about his own journeys, the small victories, the battered septon who knighted him. When Bronn asked how many men Podrick had killed by now, Podrick only looked away and shrugged. More than he cared to admit. At dawn, the two parted ways. Bronn had no interest in the Riverlands. He had a scheme that would take him north, or so he said, but he gave Podrick a friendly clap on the shoulder before mounting up. If you see our little lion, Tyrion, tell him I still want that damned castle I was promised." With a wry grin, Bronn disappeared down the winding path. Podrick stood watching until the dust settled, then slowly donned his armor. He would not forget his old friends. But the future beckoned, and time waited for no one. The riverlands, broad fields, winding rivers, the occasional stand of trees that dotted the gently rolling terrain. As Podrick traversed the roads, he heard more specific tales of trouble. A minor lord by the name of Karsten Piper was collecting war taxes from neighboring villages, using intimidation and worse. The new overlord, a distant cousin of the Freys, or so it was said, refused to intervene. The local gentry bickered about who had the right to levy taxes, while the peasants starved. Podrick decided to travel to Lord Piper's seat, a keep perched on the banks of the Red Fork. He arrived at dusk, greeted by suspicious eyes from bored guards. One of them recognized the Payne sigil on Podrick's surcoat. "Payne, eh?" the guard spat. "We had enough of your lot. Ser Island gave me nightmares." He eyed Podrick's armor. "What do you want?" Podrick kept his voice steady. "Audience with Lord Karsten. I've come to settle a matter regarding the extortion of local villages." The guard guffawed. "On whose authority?" "My own," Podrick answered quietly. The guards shared a mocking laugh, but eventually let him pass. The courtyard was small, mostly bare, with a stable to one side and a single old oak in the corner. The place smelled of horse dung and sour wine. Podrick dismounted and a stable boy scurried up, wide-eyed at the knight's harness. Inside the keep, a steward led Podrick through a narrow hall. Its walls hung with dusty tapestries that featured the red and gold colors of House Piper. Lord Karsten Piper sat on a dais in a large wooden chair. He was a man perhaps in his 40s, thick around the midsection, with a short beard streaked with gray. An expression of lazy contempt curled his mouth. Around him stood a handful of minor knights and attendants. Podrick bowed. "My lord, I come." "You come unannounced," Lord Karsten cut in. "Bold. Who are you?" "Ser Podrick Payne." "Payne? I know the name," Karsten replied, eyeing him. "Your cousin was the king's justice. I trust you're not here to try and take heads." Podrick kept his face calm, though his pulse beat faster. "I hope that won't be necessary, my lord, but I have heard troubling reports that you demand excessive levies from the nearby villages, leaving them little to eat." Karsten's laughter was loud and full of derision. "Troubling reports. Everyone wants something. I am their lord, boy. They owe me their fealty and coin. War is never cheap, and we must be prepared for what's to come. If they tighten their belts for a while, it's a small price." Podrick's throat went dry. "Your people starve." A hush fell in the hall. Some of the retainers shifted uneasily. Perhaps the truth of it weighed on them. Karsten Piper looked faintly annoyed. "Only for a season," Karsten said. "It is not your concern. Begone, Ser Payne, or I'll have you escorted out." Podrick considered his response carefully. He recalled Tyrion's lessons on how the right words could wound more than a blade if used properly. He also recalled Brienne's caution that a knight must stand for what is right, even when those in power scorn him. He tried to gather his courage. "With respect, my lord," he said, stepping forward. "If your people starve, they will not fight for you. They will not serve you. You build your own downfall by leaving them destitute." Karsten flushed a dark red. "You dare to lecture me in my own hall?" he snapped. He gestured, and a pair of guards stepped closer, hands on sword hilts. "You think to shame me? I have the right to levy taxes, and you, some wandering knight, have no right to interfere. I should have you flogged for your insolence." Podrick felt his heart hammering, but he swallowed hard and forced himself to stand taller. "I do not come to shame you, my lord, but these are not ordinary taxes. You take what little they have and they cannot survive. They are your responsibility. If you continue, you invite open revolt. I simply ask that you reconsider, that you show some leniency." Lord Piper rose from his seat, eyes blazing. He advanced down the dais, jowls quivering. "I need no lectures from a Payne. I'll not have a snot-nosed boy questioning my authority. Get out of my sight Before he could finish, one of the retainer knights, perhaps braver than the rest, stepped forward, clearing his throat. My lord, the small folk are indeed suffering. It might be wise to. Karsten spun on him. Silence. Or would you rather share in this upstart's punishment? The knight reddened and backed away. Podrick realized he was alone in this. The hall was full of men who might side with Karsten out of fear, but he caught the flicker of guilt in some eyes. Podrick felt a wave of frustration surge through him. Frustration for the plight of the people, for the arrogance of lords like Karsten Piper. It would be so easy to walk away, to leave these villagers to their fate, but that would betray everything he stood for. He steadied his breathing. Perhaps it was foolish, but he advanced one more step and kept his voice firm but calm. I cannot stand by while good people suffer. If you insist on these demands, then I must challenge you. Grant me a trial by combat. Let me fight for the cause of these people. If I lose, I'll trouble you no more. But if I win, you reduce the taxes to a fair rate. A ripple of shock passed through the hall. Lord Karsten Piper's mouth opened, his eyes wide with astonishment. Then a smug grin crept across his features. A trial by combat? Over something as trivial as taxes? Very well, boy, if that's how you want to die. I accept. He wheeled around to his knights. Which of you wants the honor of teaching this brash fool a lesson? Silence. No one wanted to leap forward, perhaps uncertain of Podrick's skill, or fearful of the moral weight of fighting for cruel taxes. Finally, a large, barrel-chested man with an ugly scar down one cheek stepped out. I'll do it, my lord, he said, flicking his gaze over Podrick. I'm Sir Richard, and I'll be your champion. Lord Karsten clapped him on the shoulder. Make it bloody. Let everyone see what becomes of meddling knights. Podrick felt a swirl of emotions. Fear, yes, but also a quiet resolve. He had put himself on this path. There was no turning back now. A trial by combat in the courtyard at sunrise was agreed upon. Karsten, looking pleased, dismissed Podrick without another word. Podrick left, jaw tight, trying not to tremble as the guards escorted him to a small guest chamber. That night he slept fitfully. He dreamed of the old times. Standing behind Tyrion in the throne room, offering cups of wine. Training with Brienne in muddy fields, his arms shaking from the weight of her sword. He dreamed of the battered Septon anointing him, the pungent smell of the oils. In all of this, one feeling remained, that he had to do the right thing, even if it cost him everything. Morning brought a clear sky. The courtyard was filled with onlookers. Some knights, some guards, a few curious small folk who had come to see the spectacle. Lord Karsten Piper presided from the steps leading into the main keep. Podrick stepped forward in his well-kept armor, helmet under one arm, sword belted at his side. Sir Richard awaited him, wearing heavier plate, a great helm. His surcoat showed a red tower on a white field. He rolled his shoulders, glaring at Podrick with a cold confidence. A herald announced the terms of the duel. Lord Karsten, seated in a high-backed chair, stared with an expression of arrogant pleasure. The hush before the fight was thick with tension. Podrick closed his eyes briefly, remembering the face of every innocent person who had looked to him for help. He made a silent prayer to the seven. Then he placed his helmet over his head, slid down the visor, and drew his sword. The fight began. Sir Richard charged first, brandishing a long sword that flashed in the morning light. Podrick raised his shield, braced himself. The impact rattled his teeth. He stepped aside, quick as he could, letting Richard's momentum carry him forward. Podrick turned, slashing at Richard's flank. Metal rang against metal, glancing off the man's armor. They circled each other. Richard was larger, stronger, but Podrick had speed and careful technique. Blow after blow rained down. Richard hammered Podrick's shield, testing his defense, forcing Podrick to retreat a few steps. Podrick let him push, waiting for an opening. Richard's style was aggressive, bordering on reckless. Podrick sidestepped a powerful overhead strike. He slashed beneath Richard's sword arm, biting into mail. Richard grunted, staggering slightly, but pressed his attack with renewed fury. A savage blow caught Podrick's shield edge, splintering the rim. Podrick's arm burned from the impact. Another strike came, aiming for Podrick's thigh, but Podrick managed to pivot, parrying away the blow. Around them, the courtyard audience murmured. Lord Karsten leaned forward, scowling at every sign that Podrick was holding his own. Slowly, blood seeped from Richard's wounded arm, staining his surcoat. He began to huff breath, and Podrick realized the man's stamina was starting to fade. But one misstep could be fatal. Richard lunged with a thrust aimed at Podrick's center mass. Podrick turned, deflecting with his battered shield, and seized the moment. He pushed inside the man's guard, driving his pommel into Richard's visor with a jarring smack. Richard reeled. Podrick pivoted behind him, hooking the knight's leg with his foot. Richard went down on one knee. Cheers and gasps erupted from the watchers. Karsten Piper was on his feet, fists clenched in frustration. Podrick placed the tip of his sword at the back of Richard's neck. "Yield," Podrick said, breathing hard, voice muffled by his visor. "Do not force me to kill you." Richard hesitated, panting, then let his sword clatter to the ground. "I yield," he said, thick with hatred and resignation. Silence, then an uproar. The small folk cheered. Karsten Piper's face darkened like a thundercloud. Podrick lowered his sword, took a step back. He had won, and with that came the knowledge that Lord Piper was bound by the law of trial by combat to honor the terms. Podrick lifted off his helmet, letting the cool air wash over his sweaty face. He faced Lord Piper. Karsten sneered. "Well, by the gods, you are the victor." There was a mocking tone in his voice. "So you want me to reduce taxes? That's your demand?" Podrick sheathed his sword. "A fair tax, not one that starves them." He hesitated. "And leave them enough seed for next year's planting. You owe them that much." Karsten's lip curled. "Very well. A fair tax, then, and more seeds for the fields. You have your precious victory, Sir Podrick." He said the words, though it was clear he loathed them. The small folk who had witnessed the combat began whispering among themselves, smiling tentatively. They had seen a miracle, or what felt like one. A single knight defeating a lord's champion to defend their livelihood. Podrick offered a nod, relief washing over him, though he knew Lord Piper could still break his word once he was gone. But for now, Podrick had done what he could. That afternoon, he departed the keep. His shield was half ruined from the duel, splintered and useless, so he gave it to the stable boy to dispose of. "Thank you, sir," the boy said quietly, eyes shining with gratitude. "You saved a lot of us." Podrick managed a small, tired smile. "Do your best," he said. "It takes more than one battle to change the world. But this is a start." And so he rode on. Tales of his victory spread, no matter how modest he tried to be. They called him the Knight of the People, the Shield of the Innocent. Podrick reddened at such titles. He was only trying to fulfill the vow he had made. Yet bigger storms brewed. Podrick received word that the Westerlands had erupted in conflict between two Lannister cousins vying for the remnants of Casterly Rock's power. Mercenaries flooded the region, and the towns near the border suffered. Podrick was torn. He felt compelled to help. He knew how destructive such conflicts could be for the small folk. He angled his path westward. If the realm was on the brink of another devastating war, perhaps, just perhaps, he could prevent needless bloodshed. Across the miles, from the Trident to the foothills near the Golden Tooth, Podrick pushed onward. He slept in barns or under the stars, relying on the generosity of strangers who recognized him from rumors or simply saw his gentle manner. Though he would not speak of them often, his deeds had a life of their own, traveling in the voices of bards and storytellers, embroidered a bit more each time. Some said he'd fought off a dozen knights. Others claimed he wielded magic. That made Podrick laugh nervously whenever he caught wind of such tall tales. By the time he reached the outskirts of the Westerlands, He encountered streams of refugees, dirty, hollow-eyed folk fleeing ravaged villages. Their stories were the same. Mercenaries hired by Lannister scions roamed the countryside, stealing crops, burning fields, forcibly recruiting young men. "Ser Podrick?" they whispered in awe. "Are you here to save us?" Podrick felt that old weight press on him, but he nodded. "I'll do what I can," he said. He learned the shape of the conflict quickly. Two main claimants from distant branches of House Lannister had gathered support after the downfall of the main line. One was Lady Jenna Lannister, an elderly matriarch who commanded the loyalty of many bannermen who remembered her from decades past. The other was Ser Daemon Lannister, a younger, flamboyant knight rumored to have cunning to rival Tyrion's. They were locked in a battle over who would hold Casterly Rock. Each had hired sellswords, Golden Company deserters on one side, cutthroats from Essos on the other. The lords of the surrounding area were forced to pick sides or risk losing their lands. Meanwhile, the fields burned, and the commoners starved. Podrick realized confronting the two heads of this hydra directly would be near impossible. Each commanded armies. Instead, he set about protecting whoever he could. He found a small hamlet beset by mercenaries. Without hesitation, he rode into their midst, surprising them with a quiet fury. His sword flashed, and he left 3 men dead, the rest scattering. Another day, he guided a group of peasants safely through the woods to a less dangerous region, fending off roving brigands along the way. Bit by bit, like a man trying to empty the sea with a cup, Podrick kept at it. His reputation in the Westerlands grew in leaps. Lady Jenna Lannister heard rumor of this knight interfering with her men's requisitions. Ser Daemon Lannister likewise saw messages that a Ser Payne was making him lose control of certain roads. Over time, the mercenaries began traveling in larger groups, determined to kill the knight who thwarted them. Podrick found himself ambushed more than once. He was battered, bruised, his armor dented, but each time he escaped or fought through. He was only one man, though, and the toll weighed on him. Eventually, battered and exhausted, Podrick found shelter in an abandoned watchtower on a rocky rise. He kindled a small fire, checking his wounds by the flickering light, cuts on his shoulder, bruises on his ribs. He had lost weight, and a certain weariness haunted his eyes. Rubbing the scar on his forearm, he wondered if this was all for naught. War consumed everything. Each time he saved a village, another fell. Perhaps he was chasing windmills. Perhaps the realm would never truly be at peace. But as he stared into the flames, an image of Brienne's face rose in his mind's eye. He remembered how she had once told him, "Even if the world calls me a fool, I will protect the innocent. I will keep my vows. There is no shame in trying, Podrick." A faint smile tugged at his lips. He took solace in that memory. In the morning, he resolved to keep going. He would travel west, deeper into the conflict, see if he could somehow speak to one of these Lannister pretenders, reason with them. Maybe it was naive, but he had to try. The next 2 days were a haze of travel along dusty roads, riding from sunrise until dusk. On the 3rd day, a thunderstorm gathered, dark clouds rolling in from the sea. Podrick sought shelter in an old barn near a half-ruined manor. He tethered his horse in a corner and leaned against a rickety wall, letting the rain pound the roof. He had barely settled when he heard voices outside, shouting to be heard over the storm. He peered through a gap in the boards. A troop of armed men approached, their red cloaks battered by the wind. A standard flapped, a golden lion on a crimson field. Not the official Lannister banner, but close enough, likely Daemon Lannister's mercenaries. They strode into the barn, water streaming from their armor, cursing at the foul weather. Podrick shrank back into the shadows. He counted 6 of them, all with swords or axes. One removed his helm, revealing a shaved head and a cruel scar. Another lugged a crossbow. They were talking loudly. "Daemon's orders are to sweep the area for that meddling knight," Scarface grunted. "Someone said he's called Payne. Reckon he's a cousin to Ser Island? Heard he's unstoppable." He snorted. "I'll put a bolt in his back if I see him." Podrick's heart hammered. Facing 6 men alone in a confined space was risky. But if they discovered him, it would be worse. Perhaps if he bided his time, he could slip away. Yet his horse was in the same barn. They might discover it any moment. One of the men cursed, kicking at a pile of straw, revealing Podrick's saddlebags. "What's this?" Podrick realized the time for hiding was over. He stepped out, sword in hand, heart pounding. "I'm here," he said, voice steady. "I'd prefer not to fight." They whirled on him, startled. Scarface bared his teeth. "You? Wait. That sigil on your surcoat. You're Payne." He laughed, a harsh bark. Well, what luck, boys. The bounty on your head is enough to keep us in wine for a year." Podrick raised his shield, battered though it was. He scanned their positions, the meager space, the crossbow pointed at him. "I only want to protect these lands. Stand aside." They didn't. The crossbowman loosed a bolt, forcing Podrick to drop behind his shield. The bolt struck with a dull thud, lodging in the wood. Another man lunged with a spear, but Podrick stepped aside, slicing at the haft. Wood splintered, and the mercenary stumbled. Podrick bashed him with the shield, knocking him back into a stack of barrels. Scarface roared and charged with a sword, attacking with brute force. Steel clashed in the gloom. The other men circled around, seeking an opening. Podrick's breath came in quick bursts. He had to move carefully. One slip and he'd be overwhelmed. Rain hammered the barn roof as the storm grew fiercer. Water poured through cracks in the ceiling, making the floor slick. Podrick feinted high against Scarface, then pivoted, slashing another mercenary across the thigh. That man shrieked and went down. The crossbowman reloaded frantically, cursing the damp. Podrick advanced, grabbing the muzzle and jerking it aside just as it fired. The bolt went wide, burying itself in a post. Podrick slammed his hilt into the crossbowman's face, sending him sprawling. But Scarface took advantage, raking his sword along the gap near Podrick's backplate. Podrick felt a hot slash of pain. He gasped, staggering, nearly losing his grip on the sword. Another mercenary lunged, hacking at Podrick's shield. Podrick ducked, the blow slicing the air above his head. With a desperate thrust, he caught the man in the abdomen. A spray of blood. Podrick grimaced, pulling back. Scarface came again, relentless. Blow after blow rained down. Podrick's arms trembled with fatigue. He retreated, trying to keep all enemies in sight. They pressed him against the barn wall. He dropped low, hooking Scarface's ankle, forcing him off balance. As Scarface stumbled, Podrick lunged upward, sword aimed at the man's exposed neck. A wet cough, then Scarface collapsed. That left 2 men still standing. Their expressions were grim. One had an axe, the other a sword. Podrick's side stung from the slash he'd taken. His breathing was ragged. He braced for the next attacks. But the men hesitated. They had seen the carnage around them. They saw Podrick's unwavering stance, blood dripping from his blade, the bodies of their companions. The axeman dropped his weapon. "I yield," he cried, stepping back. The swordsmen followed suit. They raised their hands, fear written across their faces. Podrick sagged against the wall, panting. Lightning flashed outside. The storm roiled. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Leave your weapons. Go. Warn others to halt these raids. War is coming, but the people are not your enemy." They left, stumbling into the downpour, half terrified. Podrick set aside his sword with shaking hands and clutched his side. Blood was leaking through his armor. He quickly stripped off the plate, biting his lip at every flare of pain. The wound wasn't mortal, but it was deep enough to need bandaging. With the remnants of cloth from his pack, he bound it tightly. It was a long, agonizing night. He could barely sleep, feverish from pain. When the storm subsided near dawn, Podrick forced himself onto his horse, leaving the barn and the bodies behind. He needed proper care, but who would give it to him? Half the Westerlands was in turmoil. He remembered rumors of a sept in the hills, a place that had avoided the worst of the conflict and took in travelers. Gritting his teeth, he urged his horse westward. Each mile was a trial. The pain in his side radiated through every bone. At times he thought he might collapse. Yet he pressed on, driven by the faint hope of sanctuary. By midday, the sun burned through ragged clouds. Podrick spotted a modest structure on a hillside, a simple stone sept with a handful of cottages around it. The seven be praised. He reached the septry's courtyard with a faltering step. A septa in gray robes hurried out, alarmed at the sight of the bleeding knight. Gentle hands helped him dismount. Podrick felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, but he clung to the edges of awareness long enough to say, "I only want to do what's right." Darkness claimed him. He woke days later, lying on a pallet in a stone chamber that smelled of herbs and incense. His side was tightly bandaged. A young novice dabbed his forehead with a damp cloth. "You're awake," she whispered, relief plain on her face. "Stay still. The wound was bad, but the septa says you'll recover." Podrick tried to speak, but his throat felt raw. The novice helped him sip water. He sank back, exhaustion tugging at him. Over the next few days, the sisters of the sept tended his injuries, feeding him thin broth and changing his bandages. Gradually, he regained strength, able to walk around the courtyard and speak with some of the other refugees who had found shelter there. The sept was neutral ground, and neither Lady Jenna's nor Ser Damon's forces had troubled it. Yet the tension beyond those walls remained. Podrick learned from a traveling pilgrim that a major battle was brewing near Ashmark. Both Lannister factions had marshaled their forces. Word was that Daemon Sellswords planned to torch the countryside to draw Jenna's troops into disadvantageous ground. Thousands of small folk would be left homeless or worse. Podrick felt a stab of dread. He could not simply stay in the sept and heal while a slaughter of innocents loomed. Though the septa advised him to rest, Podrick insisted on leaving once he could walk without doubling over in pain. He thanked them profusely, leaving what coin he had for their kindness. One of the novices frowned. "You're still wounded. Don't throw your life away. You can't stop an army." Podrick squeezed her hand gently. "No, but I may help some of the innocents caught in the middle. That's enough reason to try." And so Ser Podrick Payne rode out again, bandaged and not fully healed, but determined. He traveled slowly, each step of the horse jarring his wound. News drifted to him in pieces. The armies were converging near a broad plain by the Ashmark River. He heard of peasants fleeing east, told him that Daemon's men were forcibly conscripting anyone they could find, from teenage boys to old men. Podrick doubled his pace, ignoring the pain. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could reach them in time, maybe strike a deal, or at least lead some innocents away from the battle zone. He arrived on the outskirts of the Great Plain at dusk. Fires dotted the landscape, camps of thousands. On one side, Lady Jenna's banners, gold lions on red fields, flanked by small contingents of allied houses. On the other, Daemon's men with makeshift lion sigils, plus a host of mercenaries. Between them, clusters of terrified villagers huddled, not sure which side was safer. Podrick's heart sank at the scale of it all. His single blade felt like a twig in a hurricane, but he pressed forward. Tents lined the plain. Podrick guided his horse among them, unnoticed at first in the growing darkness. He saw old men hammered into rough squads, fresh conscripts. Some looked half-starved. He noticed a young woman, her cheeks streaked with tears, forced to carry water to Daemon's troops. Anger flared in Podrick's chest. He dismounted, approached a guard. "I must speak to Ser Daemon Lannister," he said. The guard eyed him. "And you are?" "Ser Podrick Payne." Recognition flared in the man's eyes. He stepped back. "The knight rumored to hamper our efforts? You have a lot of nerve coming here." Still, the guard seemed unsure about arresting him on the spot. Podrick waited, tension coiling in his gut. At last, the guard relented, motioning him to follow. "I'll take you to the commander's tent. If you try anything foolish, you'll be skewered before you blink." Inside the large command tent, torchlight revealed a gathering of mercenary captains, minor Westerland's lords who had thrown in with Daemon, and at the center stood Ser Daemon Lannister himself. He was tall, with a narrow face and blonde hair pulled back in a tight queue. A cunning glint lit his pale green eyes. He wore a fine doublet with a golden lion embroidered on the breast, though the edges were worn, an heirloom perhaps. Conversation halted at Podrick's entrance. Damon looked him over with mild amusement. "I've heard of you, Sir Payne, the righteous knight who meddles in my affairs." Podrick drew a breath. "I only protect the small folk. They suffer enough without being conscripted or burned out of their homes. Why must we have another war that kills thousands for a seat in Casterly Rock?" Damon gave a short, derisive laugh. "You think this is about me wanting a shiny castle? Casterly Rock is a symbol. The West needs leadership, or it will be overrun by neighboring lords, drowned in petty wars. Jenna Lannister is old, stuck in her ways. We need new blood, new ambition. Yes, there's a price to pay. War always has a price, but in the end, the West will be stronger for it. The small folk will thank me when I bring prosperity." Podrick felt a wave of disgust, but he kept his voice calm. "They'll be too dead to thank anyone if you burn their fields and conscript their sons. I've seen what you do to those who resist. This is not how you gain loyalty." One of the mercenary captains spat. "We do what we must. We get paid. You have no idea how many are waiting to snatch these lands. Better Damon with an iron grip than a foreigner with none." Podrick clenched his fists. The old memory of Tyrion's cynicism flickered in his mind. How so many sought power without caring for the cost. At least let the innocents leave. Let the elderly, the children, and those who cannot fight pass through. Let them escape your battleground. Damon regarded Podrick with cool composure. "And why would I do that? They might run to Jenna's camp, giving her numbers. No, we need them under our watch, ensuring no advantage goes to the other side." Podrick's jaw tightened. "A child cannot fight for Lady Jenna, nor can the elderly. You'd hold them hostage, starve them." Damon made a dismissive gesture. "They're not my concern. My concern is winning." Silence. Torches crackled. Podrick realized he could not sway Damon with appeals to mercy. The man was too entrenched, too convinced of the righteousness of his ambition. Despair swirled in Podrick's gut. He tried one last time. "Then grant me a small corridor. I'll lead out only those who truly cannot fight, the women, children, and elderly. Let them pass. They pose no threat to you. Show the realm you're not a monster." Damon studied Podrick, a cold smile creeping across his face. "That is what you want?" "Yes," Podrick said. A weighted pause. Then Damon shrugged. "As it happens, I do want the realm to believe I'm capable of mercy." "Fine. You want to lead out the helpless? Very well, Sir Podrick. At dawn, gather them at the eastern edge of the plain. You'll have a few hours. After that, anyone left behind is fair game." Podrick's chest lightened. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was something. "You have my thanks, my lord." Damon's eyes glimmered with calculation. "If you try to smuggle out men of fighting age, or attempt to sabotage my lines, my men will open fire. Clear?" Podrick nodded solemnly. "Clear." He turned to leave, feeling the stares of the mercenary captains on his back. But Damon's voice stopped him. "Oh, and Sir Payne, tell the small folk who saved them. Tell them it was Daemon Lannister's mercy." Podrick didn't reply. Outside, he exhaled shakily into the cool night air. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it might spare lives. He set to work immediately, moving among the frightened clusters of commoners, telling them they had a chance to leave come dawn. Many were skeptical. Others looked hopeful. He tried to rally them, to gather them in one place. He negotiated with anxious guards, verifying he was acting on Daemon's orders. It was chaos in the darkness, but by the time the sun's first light crawled over the horizon, he had herded hundreds of elders, children, mothers with babes in arms, the infirm, and others ill-suited for war. They stood in a miserable line along the eastern edge of the plain. The mercenaries watched them like hawks, but they did not interfere as Podrick led them away. The column stretched on, a ragged caravan of the helpless. Podrick's side throbbed painfully with each step, but he forced himself to ride up and down the line, shouting encouragement, urging them to keep moving. By midday, they had cleared the immediate area of Daemon's forces. Yet danger still lingered. Lady Jenna's scouts might see them as an invading group, or brigands might attack. Podrick had no illusions that the journey would be safe. Still, they were away from the battlefield, away from certain slaughter. Some cried with relief, others marched in stunned silence. Podrick guided them along the outskirts, hoping to find a route south where rumored farmland lay untouched. He knew farmland alone wasn't enough, but it was a start. He prayed they'd find shelter in a loyalist hold or a place that recognized the plight of innocence. They pressed on for days, the line becoming weaker, smaller as some found refuge with sympathetic lords or old acquaintances. Podrick refused to leave any behind who needed him, so he stayed with the last group until they reached a rundown holdfast occupied by a hedge knight known for his compassion. Only then did Podrick feel he had fulfilled what Daemon had allowed. Even if the war claimed thousands, at least these people stood a chance. Once the last child had been taken into the holdfast, Podrick stood outside, his horse stamping tiredly. He felt drained, physically and emotionally. The bandage at his side needed changing. He had lost track of days since leaving Daemon's camp. Perhaps by now, Lady Jenna and Ser Daemon were locked in their final confrontation. He shouldered his pack. He still had a vow. If there were others who needed help, he would find them. If not, perhaps he could speak to Lady Jenna, try to negotiate some measure of restraint. He rode into a crimson sunrise, the color of blood spattering the sky. The wind carried the distant thunder of hooves, the faint drumbeat of armies on the march. War was upon the land. Podrick Payne, once a shy boy who stammered and served wine, was now a knight who had fought in countless skirmishes, saved hundreds of innocents from certain doom, and stood like a thin shield against the ceaseless cruelty of men. In the days to come, Podrick would find himself amid the greatest battles of this new conflict. His name would be whispered in fear by mercenaries and praised by fleeing peasants. Many would wonder how such a modest knight could wield so great a skill in war and maintain such a gentle spirit. The truth was that Podrick's skill was not inborn brilliance. It was born of devotion, to Brienne's teaching, to Tyrion's sense of compassion, to the unwavering ideal that good people were worth protecting. No matter how many times he was knocked down, no matter how deep the wounds, Podrick Payne would rise again. He would ride into the heart of the storm, sword in hand, not out of lust for glory or thirst for blood, but out of the simple conviction that, in a realm of darkness and despair, a single beacon of hope could save lives. And so he rode on, a knight of quiet grace, forging a legend that would echo in campfires and halls alike. That of the humblest Payne, who rose from squire to ser, reshaping battles with his surprising skill, and reminding the world that in every corner of war, mercy could still flourish if held by a steadfast heart. Podrick Payne rode toward the rising sun, the sky aflame with red and gold, the wind carrying distant thunderclaps of drums and hooves across a war-torn land. His armor still bore crusted blood around the buckles from the ambush in the barn. The bandage at his side itched beneath his quilted doublet. Yet he pressed on, jaw set, determined to do what he could in the midst of the Westerland's chaos. It was said that a great and final clash loomed. Lady Jenna Lannister's forces arrayed against Ser Daemon Lannister's host, each hoping to claim Casterly Rock in a bid to control the West. Podrick was no lord, no general, merely a knight anointed in a battered sept, but he felt he must bear witness, if not prevent further bloodshed. He had seen enough suffering in this realm to fill a lifetime. The faces of frightened peasants and conscripted boys haunted his dreams. He had led out those who could not fight. The elderly, the children, mothers with newborns, all allowed passage by Daemon's grudging mercy. That had been something, a small flicker of hope in the darkness. But it did nothing for the thousands of men poised to die on the field. Each side saw itself as the rightful heir to Lannister legacy. Each had 1,000 or more swords bristling with tension and cunning. Each was desperate. Desperation was the father of cruelty. Podrick had learned that lesson as a squire in the days of the War of the Five Kings. People who feared losing everything would do anything, and he had no illusions that either faction was beyond atrocity. Yet he kept riding, guided by the rumors. The armies were gathering near a stretch of hills beyond the Ashmark River, close to a place called Blackbuckle Ridge. The name meant little to him, only that it was strategically vital. Beyond those hills lay the roads to Lannisport and the great fortress of Casterly Rock. Whoever controlled the ridge could choke off the other side's approach. So they would meet there in a savage confrontation. Perhaps Podrick could still plead for reason. He'd tried with Daemon, to little avail. But maybe the lady was less entrenched. From the chatter he'd heard, Lady Jenna's bannermen remembered the days of Tywin Lannister's rule. And though Jenna herself was rumored to be an iron-willed matron, she might be persuaded to spare the small folk if it suited her aims. Sometimes, in the swirl of war, the smallest concession was a candle in the night. Podrick crested a low hill at midday. Far below, in a broad valley, he saw a sea of tents and banners flapping in the summer wind. The heat was oppressive. Sweat trickled beneath his helm. In the distance, men called to each other, cavalry rode in drill formations, and smiths hammered weapons. The dust of trampled earth hung in the air like a haze. On one side of the valley, the standards displayed the proud lion of House Lannister in a more classic design, a blood-red field with the golden beast rampant, and Podrick knew that must belong to Lady Jenna's loyalists. Opposite them, an untidy sprawl of tents flew Daemon's newly embroidered sigils, or the banners of Sellsword companies from Essos, or the lesser arms of houses who had sworn to Daemon's cause. The armies were separated by a wide patch of ground that looked to be no man's land. Though the distance was so great it was more like a gulf. Here and there, outriders scouted or delivered messages. No formal battle lines had been drawn yet, but the threat of violence was thick as pitch. In these hours before the storm, everything felt poised on the edge of a razor. Podrick guided his horse carefully down the hillside, hoping to reach Lady Jenna's side. He'd never met her, only heard tales that she was formidable in youth and even more so in age. If there was even a chance she might listen to a traveling knight who had no personal stake but the welfare of the realm, Podrick would risk everything to speak with her. He rode toward the pickets at the outer perimeter of her camp. Soldiers wearing battered Lannister livery challenged him, lowering spears to block his path. Podrick lifted his visor and held up empty hands. "I come in peace," he said, his voice weary but clear. "My name is Ser Podrick Payne. I ask for safe conduct to speak with Lady Jenna, if she'll grant it." The guards eyed him suspiciously. "Payne?" one repeated, grimacing. "We know the name. Are you some cousin to the mute headsman?" Podrick nodded. "Distant cousin, yes. I mean no harm here." He saw the flicker of wariness in their eyes. Ser Eilen had always stirred fear. "I stand apart from that. I have come only to speak with Lady Jenna about avoiding further harm to the small folk." They muttered among themselves. Finally, one guard left to fetch a superior, a surly knight with a thick beard of gray shot through with black. This knight demanded to see Podrick's sword, to ensure no threat was concealed. Podrick obeyed, offering it up. The knight studied the blade, noticing the well-used edge and the faint remnants of oil. Then he handed it back, apparently satisfied that Podrick was not an assassin. "We'll take you in," the surly knight said. "But if you bring any trouble, don't think for a moment we won't cut you down." "I understand," Podrick replied. "I thank you for your courtesy." Escorted by 4 men, Podrick rode deeper into the camp. It was larger up close, a labyrinth of tents and makeshift avenues. The air carried the smells of cooking fires, unwashed bodies, and the pungent tang of a latrine trench not far away. Everywhere, soldiers prepared for the coming battle. A cart rumbled by, filled with spears. A cluster of archers tested their bowstrings, eyes grim. Farther on, a group of men-at-arms in partial plate cleaned their gear. Podrick noted the tension in every face. Even the horses whickered anxiously, as if they sensed that soon steel would clash and blood would soak the earth. Finally, they came to the center of the encampment, where a larger pavilion of deep crimson rose amid a ring of banners. A pair of knights stood guard at the entrance flap. One of them wore a surcoat with the golden lion, and the other a half-cloak pinned with a lion head brooch. Podrick's escort halted him just outside. The surly knight vanished inside to request an audience. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Podrick tried to stay calm, ignoring the pain at his side. He wondered if Lady Jenna would see him, or if she would dismiss him as a nobody. Possibly, she might greet him with hostility, seeing him as a meddler who had also bargained with Daemon. A memory flickered of Daemon's cold smile in his tent. Podrick did not relish dealing with more Lannister pride, but if it could help stave off the worst of the carnage, he would endure any scorn. At length, the knight returned, beckoning Podrick forward. He ducked inside the pavilion and found it lit by lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the fabric walls. A table stood in the middle, covered in maps and scattered with clay markers for troop dispositions. Around it, a handful of lords and knights waited. At the head of the table sat a woman with silver hair coiled in a tight braid. Her face was lined by age, yet her gaze burned with a fierce intellect. She wore a dress of dark red, trimmed with gold thread, and a cloak pinned at her shoulder with a lion's head. Podrick bowed. "Lady Jenna," announced the surly knight. "This is Sir Podrick Payne." She eyed him up and down. "So you're the traveler who's been making waves." Her voice held an edge of impatience. "You have a reputation for protecting peasants and interfering with conscriptions." Podrick stood straight, swallowing his nerves. "My lady, I come not to undermine you but to beg that you spare the small folk where you can. You must see how the wars have ravaged these lands. Another slaughter will only deepen the wound." A slight arch of one eyebrow. "You think I don't know that?" She tapped a finger on the map. "I've seen more wars than you have years, boy. The West has always paid for the ambitions of the Iron Throne, or the Targaryens, or the Baratheons, or others. Now the West must decide its own future, and if that means a final confrontation, so be it. I wish there were another way, but Ser Daemon's ambitions can't be checked with sweet words alone." "He might say the same of you," Podrick ventured gently, recalling how Daemon had spoken with scorn of the old matriarch. "You both speak of uniting the West under strong leadership. Surely there's some accord that can be reached without the shedding of thousands of lives." Jenna's eyes narrowed. "You speak as though you know the man. Daemon Lannister is cunning, yes, but he's also reckless, and we've heard of his cruelty to those who resist. He's using Sel's words from Essos, scum who won't hesitate to butcher entire villages. There can be no compromise with a man who would hold the entire West hostage. You're naive if you think otherwise." Podrick felt heat in his cheeks, but he held her gaze. "I've seen his men's atrocities. That's why I tried to save whoever I could. But I've also seen many in your own ranks who are hungry for a fight, who might not stop to spare an innocent if it meant gaining an advantage. War brings out the worst in all sides." A faint hush fell among the gathered lords. A few shifted awkwardly, as though Podrick's words hit too close to home. Lady Jenna's mouth pursed. She didn't deny it, merely tapped the table again in thought. "I know the character of my bannermen, Ser Payne," she said. "Their mood is vengeful because Daemon has been raiding our supply lines, burning our fields, and forcing good men to betray oaths that have stood for generations. It's left a bitter taste. I do not condone wanton cruelty, but neither do I pretend that war is clean." She folded her hands. "Since you're so concerned for the peasants, what do you propose? Should I yield to Daemon's claims? Should I kneel at his feet for the sake of sparing a few thousand? That might save them today, but Daemon would trample them in the years to come." Podrick inhaled, trying to find the right words. "I can't tell you how to end this war. I only beg that if you must fight, you at least allow a corridor for the non-combatants to flee, and that you instruct your men not to slaughter those who surrender. Treat them justly, with the courtesy expected of a true lord. Let families and children go when you take territory. Doing so would earn you loyalty in the West, not fear." Jenna studied him in silence, her gaze heavy. At last she gave a single, slow nod. "You remind me of another fool I once knew," she said quietly, her tone oddly reflective. "He was always spouting nonsense about the betterment of the realm, even as the realm devoured itself. But perhaps we need a few such voices to keep us from total savagery. She looked to her lords. See that the men know no killing of non-combatants. Families who wish to leave the war zone unarmed may do so. We'll keep them from Daemon's clutches, but we won't hamper their flight if they insist on going east. The lords exchanged glances. A burly man with a battered cloak cleared his throat. My lady, that's a generous policy. Will that not limit our strategic advantage? Her eyes flashed. Would you have us stoop to Daemon's tactics? This is my final campaign, perhaps, but I'll see it done with some scrap of honor intact. The lion does not feast on cringing prey. She returned her attention to Podrick. Are you satisfied? And do you plan to remain here, or run back to Daemon's lines with these negotiations? Podrick dipped his head, relief warring with lingering fear. I've no love for Daemon, my lady. I only care that fewer innocents die. If you keep your men from harming those who can't fight, I'll not hamper your campaign. She waved a hand, dismissing him. I've heard enough. You're free to stay in the camp tonight if you wish, or go as you please. This conversation is finished. She glanced at her aides, and immediately they bent over the map, returning to strategies and lines of approach. Podrick bowed, stepped back, and left the pavilion with a cautious sense of optimism. Lady Jenna was no saint, but perhaps she clung to a measure of chivalry. That might be enough to spare countless souls. Still, a knot of dread twisted in him. Even a scrupulous war was still war. Men would die, the earth would be soaked in blood, houses would burn. He rubbed at the bandage beneath his armor, thinking about how to help next. Outside, the camp was abuzz with the same frenetic energy. Word spread quickly that the confrontation with Daemon's forces would happen soon. Knights tested their gear, archers fletched new arrows, pages and squires rushed about with messages. Wanting to assess the field, Podrick rode along the perimeter and found a vantage point on a small bluff. In the distance, Daemon's camp glimmered under the fierce sun. He could see the movement of men, the faint reflection of spears. They, too, would be preparing. The final clash could come within a day, maybe two. Podrick breathed a heavy sigh. He had done all he could to push for mercy. If the battle was inevitable, maybe he could at least stand guard where the small folk might get caught in the crossfire, near the roads or the villages in the path of the armies. It wasn't glorious work, but that was never his concern. He'd help any stragglers trying to flee, patch up the wounded of either side if they stumbled off the field. He hated the idea of fighting for one faction or the other, but if Daemon's men attacked him, he'd defend himself. Perhaps that was enough. He bedded down that night near the outskirts of Jenna's camp, finding a quiet spot beside a half-fallen oak. He used his saddle as a pillow, as he had so many times before, and stared up at the stars flickering overhead. He wondered if Tyrion Lannister was out there, perhaps in some foreign land, hearing rumors of the West tearing itself apart once more. He wondered if Brienne was at peace, wherever her spirit might be. He rubbed his bruised side and murmured a short prayer to the Seven, asking for the strength to face the trials of dawn. In the earliest gray light, the drums began. Horns sounded, rousing men from uneasy sleep. Podrick got to his feet, quickly belting on his sword, adjusting his dented breastplate. Across the camp, banners were lifted, and ranks formed. The ground vibrated with the weight of many boots. Jenna's host was on the move. The plan, so far as Podrick could tell, was to march out of the valley and secure the ridgeline to the west, forcing Daemon to either meet them on unfavorable ground or retreat. If Daemon tried to outflank them, they'd pivot along the hill crests. Podrick decided to ride ahead along a smaller track that wove through farmland, hoping to find any civilians who might still be hiding. It was a lonely vigil. He crossed fields of tall grasses, the dawn sun turning the stalks golden. A flock of crows burst from behind a barn's shattered roof, cawing in protest as Podrick approached. Inside the barn, he found nothing but abandoned tools and the remnants of a farm cart. He moved on, checking a nearby cluster of huts. No one. The people had either fled days ago or been conscripted by Daemon's men. Cold emptiness filled these once living places. As the hours passed, he heard the distant clash of steel, the echo of war cries, the thrum of arrows. The two armies must have collided in earnest. He spurred his horse, unsettled by the sound, yet still set on his course of scanning the edges for refugees. Eventually, he spotted movement among a stand of willows near a small stream. Carefully he approached, calling out in a calm voice. 3 children and an old woman emerged, trembling. "Please, sir," the woman begged, "don't hurt us. We have nothing." Podrick gently dismounted. "I won't harm you. If you stay here, though, the battle might sweep this way. Lady Jenna has promised safe passage for those who can't fight, so maybe I can get you to her lines or guide you farther off." The woman gave a shaky nod. The children looked at Podrick's sword with large, frightened eyes. One of them, perhaps 7 years old, clutched a ragged doll. This was precisely why Podrick had come, to ensure these innocents weren't trampled. He told them to follow, leading the old woman by the arm. His horse trotted behind. Reins looped over Podrick's wrist. They crept along the winding path, the sounds of conflict growing louder, until they glimpsed the battlefield in the distance. A broad expanse of rolling ground was awash in chaos. Men in red or gold surcoats clashed with men in mismatched armor and cloaks, sellswords shrieking battle cries. Here and there, the shapes of fallen horses dotted the field. Banners drooped, spattered with mud and blood. Arrows arced overhead, a deadly rainfall. Podrick's heart pounded. The scale of it pressed on his mind like a nightmare. This was no small skirmish. This was a pitched battle that could decide the fate of the Westerlands. He tried to skirt around the main fighting, but pockets of conflict rippled outward unpredictably. A band of Daemon's mercenaries galloped by, yelling commands in some foreign tongue, chasing down a handful of Jenna's outriders. The thunder of hooves shook the earth. The children whimpered, burying their faces against the old woman's skirts. Podrick guided them into a shallow ditch, pressing them to crouch among the reeds. He peeked over the lip, shield raised warily, in case stray arrows flew. A moment later, a mounted sellsword spotted them, peeled off from his formation, and trotted over. He wore a dented half-helm and a cloak of deep green. His horse snorted, and Podrick's own mount stomped nervously. "You there!" the sellsword barked, voice carrying an Associ accent. "Step away from the peasants and surrender your arms." Podrick's lips thinned. "These are children and an elderly woman. They're no threat. Let them go." The sellsword sneered. "Daemon wants no more peasants fleeing to Jenna. They might carry information. I'll take them in." He brandished a short spear. "Throw down your sword or I'll skewer you." Podrick could almost taste the tension. Slowly, he slid the old woman behind him, then raised his shield. He spoke in a low voice. "I have no quarrel with you personally. Let me lead them out of harm's way, and you won't have to draw blood." The sellsword spat. "Fool, I'm already paid to draw blood." He lunged with the spear, aiming at Podrick's chest. Podrick barely had time to shift, bracing his shield. The spear point struck the battered metal with a dull thunk. Podrick staggered from the force, but held his ground. The horse danced sideways, hooves churning mud. Podrick pressed forward, hooking the spear with the rim of his shield and yanking downward. The sellsword cursed, trying to pull back, but Podrick's unexpected strength tore the weapon from his grip, fell into the reeds. Snarling, the man drew a curved sword from his belt and slashed at Podrick's head. Podrick ducked, feeling the whistle of the blade over his helm. With a swift counter, he rammed the sellsword's thigh with the edge of his shield. The horse lurched, and the rider nearly lost his seat. "You want to fight for gold?" Podrick said, breath hitching. "Then fight me, not them." He thrust upward with his sword, forcing the sellsword to block with a desperate parry. The clash of steel rang in the humid air. The children cried in terror, huddling closer together. The sellsword, though battered, was no novice. He circled, trying to gain momentum for another strike from horseback. But Podrick pivoted deftly, calling on every bit of training Brienne had drilled into him. He ducked inside the rider's guard and slashed the horse's flank. Not a lethal cut, but enough to startle the animal. The horse reared, squealing, and the sellsword was thrown back. He hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. Before the man could scramble to his feet, Podrick was there, sword poised at his throat. "Yield," Podrick commanded, voice tight. "I don't want to kill you." The sellsword glared, spitting out mud. He seemed on the verge of resisting, but one look at Podrick's determined stare and the blade's gleam convinced him. He dropped his curved sword. "I yield," he mumbled, fury turning his face red. Podrick backed off a pace. "Ride away from here. You've lost your horse, but your life is spared. The children come with me." The man grabbed his sword, hesitating as though he might try one last lunge. But seeing the angle of Podrick's blade, he changed his mind, threw Podrick a look of withering hatred, and limped off, cursing in his foreign tongue. By the time he vanished among the swirling chaos, Podrick's limbs shook with adrenaline. He forced himself to calm. "It's all right," he said, guiding the old woman and the children out of the ditch. "We must move quickly. Keep behind me." They pressed eastward, skirting the edges of the battlefield. The roar of combat escalated with every moment. Clouds of dust and the stench of blood clung to the summer air. Podrick glimpsed lines of infantry colliding, men screaming as they fell. Cavalry charges thundered. Arrow volleys whistled overhead. Steel clashed and sparked. In the distance, a great lion banner collapsed under a wave of mercenaries, only for another wave of Jenna's men-at-arms to surge forward, reclaiming it. Here and there, knights in flamboyant armor turned the tide in small pockets. But overall, it was impossible to say who had the upper hand. All Podrick could see was that hundreds, if not thousands, would never return home. They made it through a shallow ravine, rocks scraping at their boots. On the far side, Podrick spotted a tree line that might provide cover. He and the little group rushed across open ground, hearts hammering. Arrows hissed around them, one embedded in the earth a few feet away. The children shrieked, and Podrick lifted his shield overhead, glancing back to ensure they were unhurt. Another arrow slammed into the shield with a dull thwack, almost knocking him off balance. He steeled himself, pressing forward. At last they reached the trees. The old woman collapsed against the trunk of a pine, breathing hard. The children whimpered, holding each other. Podrick hunkered down. He spotted a small path that might lead them farther from the fighting. "We can't rest here long," he said gently. "Arrows might still find us. Can you walk?" "I'll manage," the old woman said, voice trembling. "Bless you, sir. We'd be lost without you." Podrick gave a tight nod, feeling the weight of responsibility. He led them along the path. Through the gaps in the foliage, he glimpsed the horror on the battlefield. Then the path dipped, and thick undergrowth blocked the view. Their progress was slow. The woman limped, and the children stumbled over roots. Occasionally, Podrick paused to listen for pursuers. The war raged behind them, but for now, no one seemed to chase this little band of defenseless folk. At last, they emerged onto a slope where, by some stroke of fortune, a small group of Jenna's outriders was passing. 3 men on horseback, battered and out of breath. Spotting Podrick, they reined in. One recognized the Payne sigil on Podrick's surcoat, though it was stained with mud and half-ripped from an earlier skirmish. "Sir Payne," the lead outrider said, pointing. "You'll want to keep off the main roads. Damon's cavalry is everywhere. The lines are in chaos. Lady Jenna is pushing them back on the left flank, but Damon's men hold the ridges on the right. Who knows how it'll end?" Podrick nodded. "These civilians need safety. Will you escort them to Lady Jenna's rear lines?" She ordered that non-combatants be spared. We can take them," the outrider said. "But be warned, sir, the fight's not going well in some parts. You may be cut off if you stay too long." Podrick glanced at the old woman, at the children, heartsick that all he could do was pass them off. But at least they'd reach relative safety. "Thank you. May the 7 bless you for it." The outriders lifted the children onto their saddles, helping the old woman as best they could. When she was mounted behind one of the soldiers, she turned back to Podrick, tears shining in her eyes. "You're a true knight," she whispered. "I never thought I'd see one again." Podrick offered a sad smile. "I was taught by one greater than I. Go with them now." They galloped off, hoofs kicking up dust. Podrick stood alone, the distant roar of battle rumbling through the hills. He thought of the legion of others who might be caught in the crossfire. He could not save them all. That truth gnawed at him, but he could try. Gripping his sword, he trudged back toward the sounds of clashing steel. He lingered at the edges of the fighting, always scanning for terrified peasants who might be trapped. He found a wounded boy, perhaps 15, wearing makeshift armor with Damon's sigil stitched on. The lad's breath came in ragged gasps, blood blooming at his shoulder. Podrick knelt beside him, removed the boy's half-crushed pauldron, and did his best to stanch the bleeding with a strip of cloth. The boy's glazed eyes flickered with panic. "Don't kill me," the boy rasped. I was forced to fight. They pressed me." Podrick shook his head. "Easy. I won't harm you." He gently bound the wound. "What's your name?" "Rory," the boy coughed, tears leaking from his eyes. "Please help me. I don't want to die here." Podrick looked around. The field was shifting once again. A ring of pikes bristled a few hundred yards away, and cavalry hammered into them with sickening force. Corpses lay strewn about. The cacophony of war was like a monstrous roar that never ended. Podrick's thoughts raced. He couldn't carry the boy in the midst of a raging battle, and if he left him here, he'd likely bleed or be trampled. At last, he spotted a shallow gully behind a stand of brush that might hide them. With great effort, Podrick hoisted the boy over his shoulder, ignoring the agony that flared at his own half-healed wound. He stumbled into the gully, setting the boy down gently. Water trickled along the bottom. The brush overhead offered some camouflage. "Stay here," Podrick said, panting. "I'll find help if I can. Don't move too much. Press on that bandage." He placed the boy's hand over the wound. Rory's eyes brimmed with both gratitude and terror. "But, wait, you'll come back?" "I'll try," Podrick promised. "If not me, I'll send someone. Just keep your head down." As the boy nodded fearfully, Podrick climbed out of the gully, adjusting his battered shield, scanning the mayhem. He steeled his resolve. Perhaps near the rear lines there might be a maester or a field surgeon. If he could bring them here, the boy stood a chance. So he set out, weaving through pockets of combat, avoiding direct engagements when possible. More than once, he stumbled across corpses, some wearing Jenna's sigils, others Damon's. So many young faces in the dirt. His heart clenched at the senselessness, but he pressed on. Near an open stretch of the battlefield, he found a line of tents that looked like a field hospital, or at least the closest thing to it. Wounded men lay on cloaks or blankets, groaning. A pair of women in rough-spun dresses hurried between them with bowls of water and bandages. Podrick rushed to one, breath ragged. "I have a wounded boy in the gully yonder," he said. "He's losing blood." He gestured. "I need a stretcher or someone to come with me." The woman, older and stoop-shouldered, glared at the horizon where the fighting raged. "We can't go out there," she said. "We barely have supplies for these, but there's a maester in the big tent. Maybe he can help." Desperation gnawed at Podrick. "All right, I'll speak with him." He headed for the tent, only to hear a rush of hoofbeats behind him. He spun, shield raised, to see a cluster of mounted knights bearing Jenna's red and gold. Leading them was a tall man in half-plate, visor up, face locked in grim determination. They halted sharply. One recognized Podrick from the audience with Lady Jenna. "You there?" the tall knight barked. "Sir Podrick, yes? We need every blade at the western ridge. Damon's cavalry is massing for a flanking maneuver. Our lines are stretched thin. If they break through, they'll roll up the entire flank." Podrick swallowed. "I'm no sworn sword of Lady Jenna, sir. I'm trying to aid the wounded." The knight's eyes narrowed. "Aid them by ensuring we don't lose. If Damon's cavalry smashes through, Hundreds more will be wounded or dead. Which cause do you serve? Podrick hesitated. He didn't want to be drawn deeper into the battle, but the knight's logic was harshly sound. Protecting the lines might ultimately spare more innocent lives. The boy in the gully needed help, but if the entire flank collapsed, there would be no one left to help him anyway. Podrick clenched his fists, torn. "All right," he said at last, voice husky. "Lead on. I'll do what I can." He glanced at the woman with the water bowls, speaking quickly. "There's a boy in the southwestern gully. He's badly hurt. If you can, please find a way to bring him here before it's too late." She nodded, though there was fear in her eyes. Podrick prayed she would remember. Then he turned, mounted his weary horse, and rode alongside the knights toward the western ridge. As they galloped past lines of infantry, battered and exhausted from hours of fighting, Podrick's gaze swept over the carnage. Fallen men lay in rows, some moaning for help, others silent. He forced himself to stay focused on the immediate task. If Damon's cavalry was about to flank, it could be the deciding blow. They reached the ridge, an elevated stretch of ground dotted with rocks and sparse brush. Jenna's men had formed a ragged defensive line with spears and a few archers behind them. At the crest, Podrick could see the swirling mass of Damon's cavalry at the base of the slope, gathering for a charge. The riders were at least 200 strong, their mounts snorting, armor flashing in the sun. The air thrummed with tension. Podrick dismounted and joined the line of spearmen, though he carried only his sword and shield. Nearby, a knight in scratched plate offered Podrick a short spear. "If you're to stand in the front, you'll need more reach." Podrick thanked him but declined. "I'll fight best with my sword, sir." The knight gave him a curious glance. "A sword's no good against a mounted charge unless you're a famed hero." He paused, frowning at Podrick's determined stance. "Suit yourself, but keep your wits. When the horses thunder up, it can break any man's nerve." Podrick nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Over the crash of distant lines, he heard a sudden trumpet note from Damon's cavalry. The riders broke into a canter, then a thunderous gallop, lances leveled. Dust billowed around them. The men on Podrick's line braced spears against the ground, forming a hedge of points. Archers released arrows, the shafts plunging into the charging mass, unhorsing some, wounding others. But still they came, unstoppable momentum, a wall of hooves and steel. Podrick held his shield tight, stepping slightly forward to anchor the line. He recalled Brienne's lessons on bracing for impact. Plant your feet, crouch low, let your shield take the blow, then pivot to exploit an opening. But the raw fury of a cavalry charge was something else entirely, like standing in front of a stampede. The ground shook underfoot. The first wave crashed. Horses impaled themselves on spears, screaming. Men in saddles hacked downward with swords and axes, trying to force a breach. Podrick blocked a downward slash that nearly dented his shield. The spear next to him snapped under a horse's weight, and the beast tumbled, throwing its rider. Podrick lunged at the fallen rider, piercing the man's chest before he could rise. Another horse galloped by, the rider swinging a mace that hammered into Podrick's neighbor, caving in his helmet. Blood sprayed. Podrick flinched, horror mingling with the desperate survival instinct pounding in his head. A swirl of dust enveloped them. More riders pressed forward. The line buckled, men screaming as they were trampled. Podrick pivoted, thrusting his sword upward to catch a cavalryman in the side. The blow knocked the man from the saddle, but Podrick's own foot slipped on bloody mud, sending him to one knee. A horse's hoof clipped his shield, wrenching his arm. Payne jolted up his shoulder. He grit his teeth, struggled upright, and slashed again to keep the beasts at bay. Eventually, the cavalry's momentum stalled, tangled in the press of their own dead. The defenders roared, reforming to repel the next wave. Podrick gasped for air, blood dribbling from a cut on his temple. The second wave broke in, an unstoppable tide. Archers from behind the line loosed arrows in quick succession, some whizzing just over Podrick's head, narrowly missing friend and foe alike. Horses reared, desperate to avoid the bristling spears. Podrick slashed at another passing rider, felt his blade catch mail and flesh. The rider toppled with a shriek. The horse, eyes rolling in panic, nearly barreled Podrick over. He sidestepped, shield raised. Chaos consumed every sense. Screams, clangs, the stench of open wounds and hot metal. Podrick felt the wetness of blood running down his armor. Some of it his, more of it others. His lungs burned from the dust. The sun beat down mercilessly, intensifying the haze of violence. Yet amidst it all, he recalled the patient drills Brienne had shown him. Step, pivot, shield up, sword out. Survive, protect. At last, the cavalry's impetus faltered entirely. Many of Daemon's riders wheeled away, retreating down the slope. Others fought on foot, pinned by the parted spears. Podrick saw an older knight in a torn green cloak slump to the ground, blood spurting from a gap in his armor. A horse lay dead next to him, legs thrashing. The defenders pressed forward, taking advantage of the lull, driving the survivors back. Cheers rose from Jenna's line, a savage sound. They had held the flank for now. Podrick collapsed to one knee, panting. The battlefield around him was a churn of bodies and gore. He felt like retching, but he steadied himself. The men around him slapped each other's backs, still high on adrenaline. One recognized Podrick's battered surcoat. "Seven save us, sir, you fight like a demon. Where'd you learn that?" "From the best knight I ever knew," Podrick murmured, wiping blood from his brow. "But I'm no demon. I just did my duty." He tested his limbs. The wound at his side had reopened, though not severely. His shield was cracked nearly in half. He let it drop with a heavy clang. His sword felt heavier than ever. "Sir Podrick," another soldier gasped, reining a wounded horse near him. "Orders from Lady Jenna's captains. Press the advantage and hold the ridge. They say Daemon's foot are trying to come around the far side." He pointed. "If they take that path, we'll be enveloped." Podrick nodded, though every fiber of his body screamed for rest. "We must hold, then," he said. He forced himself upright, ignoring the throbbing in his shoulder. From the vantage of the ridge, he could see Daemon's army adjusting. A line of infantry in mismatched gear was indeed advancing around a rocky fold in the hills, trying to come up behind Jenna's position. If they succeeded, the defenders would be trapped. Podrick turned to the men who still stood, some kneeling over the wounded, others pulling free battered spears from dead horses. "Form up," he said, voice raw but resolute. "We have to intercept them." He pointed with his sword to a path that skirted a rocky outcrop. "That's our route. Move." They moved. Adrenaline and fear spurred them on. This was less a formal army now and more a ragged band of survivors, perhaps 20 men strong, following Podrick because in the chaos no one else was giving coherent orders. They stumbled over corpses around the wreckage of war machines. Some men in the group were knights of lesser houses. Others were common soldiers with simple steel caps. A few carried crossbows scavenged from the fallen. Ahead, the terrain rose in a series of rocky ledges. Podrick could see Daemon's infantry pushing upward, swords and shields glinting. They might arrive at the top behind Jenna's lines if not stopped. Podrick's heart hammered, but he took some measure of hope in the vantage. The path was narrow, which meant Daemon's men couldn't swarm them all at once. If Podrick's band held the choke point, they might hold off a much larger force. They reached the choke in a clatter of armor and ragged breaths. Sure enough, below them climbed a column of Daemon's soldiers, about 50 or more. Their commander, wearing a blackened breastplate, saw Podrick's men appear. He raised his sword, bellowing orders. The column picked up speed, eager to clash. Podrick set his jaw. "Archers, crossbows, fire!" he shouted. A handful of bolts whirred down, striking the lead ranks. Screams echoed. Some tumbled off the ledge, smashing onto the rocks below. But the rest pressed on, fueled by the savage momentum of the day. Podrick quickly realized they needed every advantage. He gestured for a knot of spearmen to form a tight line across the path, the only approach to the top. Then he stepped to the front, sword in hand. The men looked at him with grim determination. The collision was brutal. Damon's infantry tried to bull-rush the line, slamming into spears with their shields. Spearmen stabbed downward, killing or wounding the front row, but the second row climbed over the bodies, hacking with swords and axes. Podrick ducked a wild swing, thrust up into a man's armpit. Blood splashed. Another soldier swung a mace, but Podrick blocked with what was left of his shield arm. Payne shot through his battered forearm, and he nearly dropped his sword. Gritting his teeth, he rammed the soldier in the chest with his shoulder, sending him staggering. One of Podrick's comrades finished him with a spear to the back. The fight snarled into a savage slog, men slipping on blood-slick rocks, curses mingling with desperate cries. Podrick felt himself fighting more on instinct than strategy, deflecting blows with quick turns, countering with stabs. He glimpsed a crossbowman from their group load and fire, sending a bolt into a man's throat. Then that crossbowman was cut down by a sword from behind. Podrick lunged to avenge him, but an axe nearly took off his head, forcing him to parry frantically. The press of bodies was suffocating. He tasted blood in his mouth. His lip must have split when he was struck. Slowly, their line began to bend under the weight of numbers. Damon's men were relentless. More kept coming, stepping over their own dead. Podrick realized with grim clarity that they might be overrun. The crossbows fired again, thinning the attackers momentarily, but it wasn't enough. He cast about for any advantage. Then he spotted a cluster of loose stones near the edge of the path, perched precariously on a ledge. If they could push them down at the right moment, they might crush a large portion of the climbing force. He shouted to 3 soldiers near him, pointing. They scrambled over, swords clanging. Together, they shoved at the stones. The attackers below noticed too late. With a rumbling crash, rocks tumbled down, sweeping away a score of Damon's men, sending them tumbling with horrific shrieks. The path partially collapsed in a cloud of dust. For a moment, everything was obscured by swirling debris. When the dust settled, the onrush had halted. Those who had survived the rockfall were scattered, injured, or pinned by rubble. The few still upright scrambled back, fear in their eyes. Some turned and fled downward, cursing the path as impassable. Podrick's men, battered and exhausted, stood victorious at the choke. Panting, Podrick wiped sweat from his brow, smearing blood across his face. Only a handful of his band remained on their feet, maybe 10 men. The others lay wounded or dead. He had no time to process the grief. He just prayed that their sacrifice had saved the flank. But the noise of battle still surrounded them. The day was far from over. Looking out across the ridge, Podrick could see plumes of smoke rising. A segment of the battlefield was ablaze, perhaps an accident with pitch or a deliberate tactic. He heard horns sounding retreat or regroup, though he couldn't tell whose. The once clear sky had become overcast, a haze of smoke and dust covering the sun. The stench of burned flesh wafted on the breeze. "We hold here," one of the knights said, voice shaking with fatigue. "We've done our part." Podrick nodded, breathing ragged. "Aye, we hold." He felt the throbbing in his reopened side wound again, trickling hot blood. He pressed a hand against it, grimacing. "We'll wait to see if reinforcements come. If they do, we can push down. But if not..." He trailed off, letting the men's imaginations fill the silence. The lull lasted perhaps a quarter of an hour. In the grand scale of a battle that spanned hours and miles, it was a fleeting respite. Podrick sank to one knee, trying to catch his breath. The men around him did the same. At his urging, they gathered what water they had left, helping the wounded among their number to drink. One man, who'd lost a chunk of flesh from his thigh, moaned softly, pale as death. Podrick knelt beside him, tearing cloth for a tourniquet, doing what he could with a shaking hand. He silently cursed the madness that had brought them all here. At last, they saw a mounted figure approaching along the ridge from behind, leading perhaps 24 riders. At first, Podrick tensed, afraid it might be another wave of Damon's men. But as they drew closer, he recognized the colors. Lady Jenna's red and gold. The leading rider slowed, raising a hand. It was the same tall knight who had first called Podrick to the western flank. He surveyed the carnage, wincing. "Gods, you held?" He breathed, genuine amazement in his voice. "We feared we'd lost the ridge, but you held." Damon's men were turned away. Podrick stood, leaning on his sword. "Yes, sir. They tried to flank us, but we collapsed part of the path. Most of them are either crushed or scattered." The knight's face flickered with relief. "Well done. You may have saved the entire army from encirclement." Then he looked over Podrick's battered group, grimacing at the injured. "I've got a few men who can escort the wounded back to the healers. But come, we're needed in the center. Word is that Lady Jenna and Damon himself are near to facing each other. The heart of the battle is near the old watchtower by the Ashmark. One decisive push could end this." Podrick's gut twisted. Another push, another wave of carnage. But perhaps the sooner it ended, the fewer would die. He nodded. "We'll come," he said quietly, ignoring the pain in his side. "But these wounded, I'll leave half my riders to tend them," the knight said. "We have little time." Podrick turned to the few who could still fight. "You heard him," he said softly. "Anyone with strength left, mount up if you can. The rest, you've done more than enough." Some men nodded, picking up battered shields or swords, climbing onto the horses. Others simply collapsed, too wounded or exhausted to continue. Podrick felt a pang of guilt. He worried that they might die here, untended, but there was no time for second-guessing. War was a cruel master. They rode along the ridge, weaving past rocky outcroppings and shallow gullies where the dead lay in twisted heaps. Columns of smoke rose from smoldering siege equipment. At last, they descended to the wide plain near the Ashmark. The watchtower was a half-ruin perched on a slight rise, once used to keep an eye on the river trade. Now it was the focal point of pitched battle. Jenna's banner stood on one side, Damon's on the other. Knights and men-at-arms clashed in a swirling melee. The ground was torn and red with blood. Corpses littered the banks of the river. The water itself ran dark, swirling with mud. Somewhere in the mass, Lady Jenna presumably directed her troops, and Damon did the same. If one side's leader fell or retreated, the day might be won or lost in a heartbeat. Podrick scanned the chaos. He saw a tall, broad-shouldered figure on a white charger, helm crested with a golden lion. That might be Damon. A ring of guards surrounded him, pressing in advance that cut through Jenna's lines. On the opposite flank, a standard-bearer lifted a banner marked with a golden lioness head, perhaps indicating Jenna's position. Arrows hissed overhead. The knight leading Podrick pointed. "We must support Lady Jenna's position, or Damon's men will overrun her guard. Follow me." They charged, lances lowered, into a knot of sellswords that threatened to flank Jenna's retinue. Podrick, lacking a lance, simply brandished his sword, pressing close behind. The clash was immediate. Their horses slammed into the sellswords, toppling some. Blades bit into flesh. Podrick found himself hacking down at men who raised scimitars or clubs, their faces contorted with rage. The press of bodies was suffocating. He heard the screams of men being stabbed, the horses' panicked whinnies. Suddenly, Podrick's mount reared, spooked by a thrust from below. Podrick nearly lost his seat, gripping the reins desperately. He managed to regain control just in time to see a sellsword scramble up with a spear, aiming for the horse's chest. Podrick slashed down, severing the man's arm at the elbow. Hot blood spattered the air. The sellsword collapsed, wailing. Podrick felt horror and pity, but there was no room for hesitation. Two more enemies rushed in. Podrick guided his horse in a tight circle, slicing one across the face, deflecting the other's sword with a hasty parry. He realized how precarious fighting on horseback could be, especially in such a mass of bodies. The horse crashed into a fallen rider, nearly pitching Podrick off. Grimly, he decided dismounting might serve him better, though it was risky. He slid off the saddle, stumbling on uneven ground. The horse galloped away, free of its burden. Podrick now faced the swirling melee on foot, sword at the ready. Jenna's standard was close. The older matriarch herself was astride a dark mare, flanked by knights in her own house colors. Her white hair, though braided, spilled from beneath an open-faced helm. Despite her age, she sat tall and proud, directing those around her. A group of Daemon's elite guards pressed in, determined to strike at the heart of her command. Jenna's knights fought furiously to keep them at bay. Podrick surged forward to join the ring around her. He battered aside a mercenary with a tattered red cloak, then found himself at the flank of a knight wearing a lion-embossed breastplate. The man recognized Podrick with a startled glance. "Help us keep them off the lady," he yelled, blocking a blow aimed at Jenna's horse. Podrick nodded, stepping in, parrying a wild slash from a grizzled soldier. Suddenly, a figure appeared through the swirl of dust. Daemon Lannister himself, easily recognizable by his gilded armor and the lion crest on his helm. His expression was fierce beneath the faceplate, eyes glittering. He carried a long sword with ornate quillons shaped like lion claws. Around him milled half a dozen personal guards. Jenna locked eyes with him across the melee. "So it comes to this?" Daemon shouted, voice carrying over the din. "Will you yield now, old woman? How many must die for your pride?" Jenna's horse snorted, backing a step. She reined it in, lifting her chin defiantly. "Listen to who speaks of pride. You sold the West to mercenaries and bedfellows from Essos, Daemon. I'll not yield to a half-foreign cutthroat." Daemon's guards advanced, but Jenna's knights closed rank around her, including Podrick. Lady Jenna, seeing Podrick, gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Daemon pointed his blade at them. "Then I'll cut you down and claim the rock by right of conquest. The realm will see that I am the true Lannister to lead us forward." "Your father would be ashamed," Jenna snapped. "All this slaughter for your vanity." A savage grin twisted Daemon's lips. "Spare me your lectures, Aunt." The final words had barely left his mouth when his guards rushed forward, swords flashing. A brutal close-quarters fight erupted. Podrick clashed with a tall guard who wielded a halberd, the sweeping arcs forcing Podrick to duck and sidestep. He managed to get inside the guard's reach, driving his blade beneath the man's chin before he could swing again. Blood sprayed. The guard collapsed, his halberd clattering on the trampled earth. Next to Podrick, Lady Jenna's horse kicked out, sending another guard flying. But Daemon himself spurred his charger forward, angling for Jenna directly. One of her knights interposed, raising a shield. Daemon's sword cut through the shield's edge, lodging in wood for a moment. The knight seized the opening, thrusting his spear at Daemon's midsection. Daemon twisted in the saddle, taking the blow on his breastplate. Sparks flew. He wrenched his sword free, reversing the strike to slice across the knight's neck. The man tumbled back with a gurgling cry. Jenna's mare reared, startled by the violence so close. Daemon seized the chance to close in. Podrick leapt forward, determined to block Daemon from striking Jenna down. His sword met Daemon's with a clang. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked. Daemon's eyes flashed with recognition. "You again?" he snarled. "The meddler." Podrick's arms trembled under Daemon's strength. "Call off your men," he gasped. "Too many have died already. You think I'd throw away victory?" Daemon barked. "You are a fool." He shoved Podrick back, nearly toppling him. Daemon's charger sidestepped, threatening to crush Podrick under its hooves. Podrick swerved, thrusting at the horse's flank, but Daemon guided the beast away just in time. Sparks flew again as their swords met. Daemon was clearly an accomplished rider and swordsman. Podrick had to draw on every ounce of skill to keep from being overwhelmed. He recalled Brienne's drills for battling mounted opponents. Attack the mount or force it to rear, deny the rider his range of motion. But Daemon, cunning, kept the horse dancing, never presenting a clean target. Their blades rang out again and again, steel singing with lethal intent. "Give up?" Daemon hissed, slashing at Podrick's shoulder. Podrick parried in a shower of sparks. "I'll make your death quick if you kneel." Podrick's reply was to grip his sword in both hands and slam it against Damon's blade, forcing it high. Then he stepped in to slash at Damon's thigh. Damon twisted away, armor screeching. He countered with a downward slash that smashed into Podrick's battered shield arm. Podrick felt something crack in his forearm, sending lightning bolts of pain through him. He let out a cry, half dropping his shield in reflex. Damon pressed the advantage, hacking downward again. Desperate, Podrick lunged to the side, hooking the horse's bridle with his free hand. He yanked hard, causing the charger to jerk its head violently. The horse stumbled, Damon momentarily thrown off balance. Podrick seized that fleeting second, ramming the hilt of his sword into Damon's side. The blow clanged off plate but jarred Damon enough that he lost a stirrup. With a snarl, the man half fell out of the saddle, landing heavily on one knee, sword still gripped in his gauntlet. Podrick staggered back, gasping in pain, his left arm dangling. Damon rose, wincing. Now they were both on foot, battered. Around them, the melee churned, men screaming and dying. Jenna, a short distance away, slashed at a Sellsword with surprising skill for her age, her knights forming a defensive ring to keep the rest of Damon's guards at bay. Damon and Podrick circled each other. Damon spat blood, wiping his mouth. "I've spilled enough blood today," he growled. "But if I must kill you to get to her, so be it." He lunged with a sudden burst of speed. Podrick parried, but the shock rattled his wounded arm, nearly causing him to drop his sword. Damon pressed, slashing at Podrick's torso. Podrick spun aside, ignoring the agony in his side, letting out a ragged breath. He managed a riposte aimed at Damon's shoulder. Damon blocked in a flash of sparks, then kneed Podrick in the abdomen. Air rushed from Podrick's lungs. He stumbled, knees wobbling. Damon's sword came around in an overhead arc. With raw instinct, Podrick raised his blade horizontally, catching Damon's slash in mid-swing. Their swords locked, crossguards pressing. Damon's face was inches from Podrick's, twisted with effort. Podrick's arms shook, nearly giving out, summoning the memory of every lesson. Brienne's unwavering stance, Tyrion's unwavering spirit. Podrick slammed his forehead into Damon's helmeted brow. A dull clang, a flash of pain. Damon reeled, cursing. Podrick wrenched free, reversed his grip, and struck a desperate blow at Damon's midsection. His sword slid between plates of Damon's armor. Damon gasped, eyes going wide. Podrick felt the jolt up his arm as the blade bit flesh. Blood seeped around the steel. Damon's face contorted with disbelief and fury. He staggered, trying to lift his sword again, but Podrick pulled his weapon free and delivered a final slash across Damon's gauntlet, sending the sword clattering to the ground. Damon sank to his knees, clutching his side. Podrick, chest heaving, stood over him, sword raised. The tumult around them seemed to fade for a heartbeat. Damon's men, seeing their leader fall, cried out in alarm. Some started forward, but Jenna's knights rushed to block them. Lady Jenna, breathing hard, reined her horse closer. "So ends your ambition," she said to Damon, her tone like stone. He glared up at her, blood on his lips. Then his gaze shifted to Podrick. You cost me everything," Damon croaked, sagging. "I should have cut you down when I had the chance." Podrick's arms trembled. He looked at Lady Jenna, uncertain. Should he deal the killing blow? Should he show mercy? He thought of all the horrors Damon had unleashed on the West. But he also remembered how every additional death fed the cycle of vengeance. Jenna read the hesitation in Podrick's eyes. "He has brought untold suffering," she said. "He might only sow further war if allowed to live, but you have earned the right to decide." Podrick stared at Damon, seeing not a monstrous villain but a man undone by greed and violence. Damon's breath rattled in his chest. Slowly, Podrick lowered his sword. "Take him captive," he said quietly. "You can hold him for ransom or justice. No more blood today." Jenna's expression was unreadable for a moment. Then she gave a curt nod. "As you wish, but he will stand trial for his crimes. Some might call that justice enough." She gestured to her knights, who stepped forward to bind Damon's hands despite his labored protests. In his wounded state, he offered no real resistance. All across the battlefield, Damon's men saw him fall and began to break, fleeing or throwing down arms. Word rippled outward, and soon horns sounded. The lines of Sel's-words collapsed. Many surrendered, others melted away into the hills. Jenna's battered army claimed the field, though at a terrible cost. The wounded littered the plain. Crows gathered overhead, cawing in grim chorus. When it was over, Podrick sank to the ground, exhausted beyond words, sword slipping from his fingers. Blood soaked his gambeson, sweat drenched his brow. He vaguely sensed Lady Jenna dismounting. She approached him with the help of 2 knights, her gaze flicking to his many wounds. "You fought bravely, Sir Podrick," she said, voice resonant. "Bravely and with honor." She hesitated. "I recall you asked for mercy for those who could not fight. You even showed it to Damon in the end. The West owes you more than it knows." Podrick breathed raggedly. "It owes me nothing, my lady. Just see that the small folk are cared for. Enough of them have suffered." She gave a slight incline of her head. "They shall be. The war is over, at least this war. I'll see Damon is judged, and I vow to protect these lands in the aftermath." It wasn't a perfect resolution. Houses had been devastated, families shattered. But for the moment, the killing had ceased. Soldiers busied themselves collecting the wounded, giving water to dying foes as well as friends. Field medics hurried about, the moans of the injured mingling with victory cheers. Somewhere in the chaos, Podrick glimpsed a battered standard still bearing the golden lion. He closed his eyes, letting the world spin, not sure if he was about to collapse or if his heart would keep him upright. A pair of arms lifted him, knights supporting him under the shoulders. "Easy, sir," one said. "We'll find you a maester." Podrick forced his eyes open. "There's a wounded boy in a gully southwestern side of the field. Please, someone must help him, too." "We'll send someone," the knight said gently, though Podrick could not see his face clearly through the blur of blood and fatigue. Podrick managed the faintest nod. Then darkness claimed him, and he sagged into unconsciousness, trusting that for once, his realm might have a chance at recovery, that the cycle of endless violence might abate, if only for a little while. He woke in a large tent with a lantern's glow illuminating a patchwork of cots. The air smelled of sour poultices and sweaty bandages. A maester in gray robes hovered over him, pressing a cup of bitter liquid to his lips. "Drink this, sir," the maester said. "It will help with the pain." Podrick swallowed, grimacing at the taste. His entire body felt like one massive bruise, and his arm throbbed where he was sure a bone had cracked. But he was alive. Slowly, memories seeped back. The final confrontation with Damon, the swirl of blood and dust, Lady Jenna granting him the choice of Damon's fate. He tried to sit up, wincing. "Easy," the maester said. "Your wounds are severe, but not fatal. That bandage on your side will need changing daily. As for your arm, I've set it as best I can, but you'll need weeks to heal fully." He gave Podrick a small nod of admiration. "They say you turned the tide at the ridge and helped capture the pretender. You'll have quite a name, if you haven't already." Podrick's mind drifted to the boy in the gully. Was there a conscript boy named Rory brought in? The maester pursed his lips. "We had many wounded from both sides. A few were younger than they should have been. I'll inquire if any answered to that name." He rose, stepping away to tend others. Podrick lay back, staring at the tent's canopy. Outside, he heard the bustle of an army reorganizing. Men's voices, horses, the ring of blacksmiths. At least the clash of swords had ceased. One day had changed the shape of the Westerlands. He prayed it would be for the better. His eyes fell shut again. He drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, haunted by visions of the battlefield. The charging horses, the screams, Damon's hateful glare. Yet within the nightmares he found flickers of memory. Guiding children to safety, sparing the life of an enemy, seeing old men and women find refuge. In those moments, he felt the faint warmth of pride and something like hope. Days passed in a blur of convalescence. Lady Jenna's forces remained encamped by the ashmark long enough to bury the dead in mass graves, treat the wounded, and gather spoils. Damon lay imprisoned in a hastily fortified corner of the old watchtower, awaiting a formal trial. Most of his mercenaries had fled or surrendered. The lesser lords who'd backed him sent emissaries to beg clemency from Lady Jenna. She heard them, though none escaped heavy fines. During this time, Podrick regained strength slowly. He walked the rows of injured soldiers when he could, offering words of comfort. Some recognized him as the humble knight who had fought Damon to a standstill. Others were too delirious to notice. A hush always fell when he passed. Soldiers might salute or whisper, "Sir Podrick Payne," with an air of respect. It made him blush as he had in days of old. But there was no escaping the effect of such a deed on their imaginations. War made heroes or villains in a single stroke. One morning, the maester returned to Podrick's cot with news. "That boy you asked about, Rory, I believe we found him. He's resting in another tent, stable for now." Relief flooded Podrick. He forced himself upright, ignoring the protest of his bruised ribs. "Take me to him, please." They walked through the camp. The carnage had mostly been cleared away, replaced by the methodical routines of an occupying force. Tents flapped in the breeze, smoke rose from cooking fires. At last, they reached a small medical tent. Inside, rows of wounded men lay on pallets. The maester guided Podrick to a corner. The boy, perhaps 15, blinked up with feverish eyes, a bandage on his shoulder. He recognized Podrick, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You came back," Rory said, voice hoarse. Podrick crouched next to him. "I'm sorry I left you there, but I'm glad you made it." He gently set a hand on the boy's uninjured shoulder. "Are they treating you well?" Rory nodded. They said they won't kill me even though I fought for Damon. They gave me water, changed my bandage." Tears welled up. "I never wanted to fight. They forced me. My pa died last year. I had no one." Podrick's throat tightened. "You're safe now," he whispered. "When you heal, you can choose your own path." Rory looked uncertain, glancing at the swirl of soldiers outside the tent. "What path is that? The fields are burned, my village gone. Where do I go?" Podrick didn't have an easy answer. "You'll have to rebuild or find a trade. Perhaps you can squire for a knight who'll treat you well." He hesitated, remembering his own journey as a squire. "If you want, when I can ride again, I'll help you find a place. No one should be abandoned." The boy blinked back tears, nodding. "Thank you." After that visit, Podrick felt a renewed sense of purpose. War left behind fragments of lives. He could not mend them all, but he could try to guide some to a better path. So once his wound had healed enough to walk unaided, he went among the prisoners, those forced to fight, not the brutal sellswords who'd committed atrocities. He spoke with them, learned their stories, promised to help them gain mercy if they truly had been conscripted. Lady Jenna's new counselors, mindful of Podrick's rising renown, let him speak on their behalf in hearings, ensuring they were not summarily executed. By the time Jenna announced her intention to march home to Casterly Rock with Damon in chains, the shape of the Westerland's future was already shifting. Lesser lords, seeing Damon's downfall, flocked to swear fealty to Jenna. She was old, but her victory had proven her strength. Some even whispered that she might name a successor or reestablish the lines of power that had fractured after Tywin's death. In the end, what truly mattered to Podrick was that the region had a chance for peace. Fields could be replanted, roads rebuilt. He only hoped that vow would not be broken by the next upheaval. On a clear morning, Podrick was summoned to an assembly at the foot of the old watchtower. Hundreds of soldiers stood in ranks, battered banners stirring in the wind. A dais had been erected. Lady Jenna ascended it, flanked by a pair of knights, her braided hair shining in the sun. She lifted a hand for silence. Though she was advanced in years, her posture was regal and commanding. "We stand upon the ashes of war," she began, voice echoing. Daemon Lannister, whose ambition cost the lives of many, is now our prisoner. He will face judgment for his crimes. Yet the West cannot dwell on vengeance forever. We must mend what is broken, bury our dead, and rebuild our homes. I promise you, as head of House Lannister, I will see these lands restored." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jenna gestured to the knights beside her. One stepped forward with a small chest. "Our houses are strong when we honor those who stand for what is right. One among us has shown extraordinary valor and mercy, embodying the highest ideals of knighthood, even at great personal cost. Sir Podrick Payne, come forth." Podrick, standing near the front, felt a flush of heat. Every gaze swung to him. He swallowed, stepping through the ranks until he reached the dais. He bowed his head, uncertain what to expect. Jenna regarded him with an appraising look. "You have done more for the realm than you realize," she said softly. "Your actions saved countless small folk, contributed to the turning of the tide in the final battle, and tempered victory with mercy." She took a breath, casting her gaze across the assembly. "Though I know you accept no reward for yourself, the West must recognize your deeds. Kneel, sir." Podrick knelt awkwardly, wounded arm still in a sling. He saw from the corner of his eye that a hush had fallen over the soldiers. Someone parted the crowd, bringing forth a finely wrought sword in a gilded scabbard. Jenna took it reverently. "This blade once belonged to my cousin Tyreek Lannister, who vanished during King Joffrey's wedding riot. It was later found and returned to our house. Now I grant it to you." She laid the sword across Podrick's upturned palms. The scabbard's metal shimmered in the sunlight. "May it serve you as faithfully as you have served the realm." Podrick lifted his gaze, astonished. He hadn't asked for such an honor, but he felt the significance. The crowd stirred, a murmur of approval. He bowed his head again. "My lady, I thank you. I will wield it, only for just causes." A faint smile creased Jenna's stern features. "See that you do, Sir Podrick." She gestured for him to rise. "The West owes you a debt. Should you ever need shelter or aid, you have but to call upon House Lannister." Podrick stood, sword cradled in his arms, heart pounding. The soldiers cheered. Even those who had once mocked the notion of a humble Payne squire bowed their heads in respect. Podrick's cheeks burned red, though part of him felt a quiet pride. Not for glory, but because every sacrifice he'd made, every life he'd tried to save, had not gone unnoticed. Perhaps Brienne would have been proud too. After the ceremony, the camp broke into more practical tasks. Rolling up tents, preparing wagons, sorting prisoners. The war was ended, and Lady Jenna was determined to march for Casterly Rock within a fortnight. Podrick found himself somewhat adrift. He had no desire to remain in the West in perpetuity, nor did he wish to become part of Jenna's new hierarchy. But he knew the land still needed help recovering, and there were prisoners like Rory who had nowhere else to go. As he paced by the river, carefully adjusting his sling, he heard a voice behind him. "Sir Podrick." He turned to see a young knight, face partially concealed by the tilt of his helm. "Yes, that's me," Podrick answered gently, still unused to the honorific. "How can I help you?" The knight removed his helm, revealing a pale face with dark hair. "My father was among those forced to fight for Daemon. He was a minor lord near the Silverhill. You spoke for clemency at his hearing. Because of you, he wasn't executed. I just wanted to thank you." Podrick gave a slight shrug. "I only did what felt right. War drags many unwillingly. If your father truly regrets his part, he deserves a second chance." The knight's eyes shone with gratitude. He pressed a small token into Podrick's hand, a lion coin from the days of King Tommen, minted in gold. "It's not much, but I'd like you to have it. A keepsake of the West's gratitude." "Thank you," Podrick said quietly. He closed his fist around the coin, feeling its edges bite into his palm. So many had lost so much to this conflict. A single coin seemed a meager symbol, but it carried a sort of significance. Reparation, acknowledgement, hope for a new start. Podrick would keep it, though he felt undeserving. He lingered by the river, listening to the water rush over stones, the breeze rustling reeds. Above, clouds drifted across a sky no longer choked by smoke. Occasionally, he heard the clang of steel from the camp as men tested newly forged swords or hammered dents from armor. He wondered about Tyrion Lannister once more. Where might that cunning mind be? In a world battered by years of war? Would he ever know how his former squire had turned out? Podrick sighed, letting the memory of Tyrion's kindness and wit buoy him. Perhaps one day they would meet again. Perhaps not. Over the next few weeks, Podrick helped finalize arrangements for the small folk displaced by the war. He organized wagons of supplies from the captured stockpiles, ensuring families were given seeds to replant. Lady Jenna, true to her word, allowed these gestures, perhaps partially out of genuine concern, perhaps because it helped stabilize her new rule. Either way, Podrick was glad to see the realm slowly healing. He also visited Rory regularly, finding the boy's shoulder healing well. One day, the boy shyly asked Podrick if he truly meant his offer, to help him find a place as a squire or servant. "I did," Podrick said. "But you must understand, it won't be easy. Training under a knight can be harsh, but it might grant you a future." Rory nodded eagerly, though his eyes were still shadowed with the trauma he'd endured. "I'd rather try that than go back to burned farms." Podrick resolved to find a knight with an honest heart who would take Rory on. Yet the more he considered it, the more uncertain he became. Many knights were reeling from the war. Who could he trust with the boy's care? In time, he found an answer from an unexpected quarter. A hedge knight called Ser Alan the Blue, known among the camp for his gentleness and sense of fairness. Ser Alan had lost his own squire in the fighting and sought a replacement to carry on. With Podrick's recommendation, Rory was accepted into Ser Alan's service. The day Rory left, awkwardly wearing a new squire's tunic, Podrick saw relief and a spark of hope in the boy's face. They clasped hands. "I'll do my best, Ser Podrick. I promise." Podrick managed a grin. "That's all any of us can do." Soon after, the time came for Podrick to depart. Lady Jenna was preparing to move her main force back to Lannisport and Casterly Rock. She extended an invitation for Podrick to join her retinue, even offering him a small tower house near the coast if he wished to remain. But Podrick declined gently. His heart told him that more troubles lurked elsewhere in the realm. The Targaryen resurgence in the east might have fizzled, but another threat always seemed to loom. If the realm still needed knights who placed justice above ambition, he felt bound to remain that sort of wandering shield. Jenna accepted his refusal with a nod of respect. "Should you ever change your mind, you know where to find me," she said. "Take care of that sword I gave you, or you'll rouse a lion's ire." She almost smiled at her jest. "And Ser Podrick, thank you." He bowed, helmet tucked under his injured arm. "Farewell, my lady. I pray the West finds peace under your guidance." And so he rode away from the Ashmark as one battle-weary host marched west, banners fluttering in tired triumph. The fields he passed were blackened by war, scorched and broken. Yet along the roads, he saw peasants beginning to repair fences, gather meager harvests, and raise new tents amid the rubble. Life persisted. Seeds grew again. Perhaps that was the truest victory. Not who held a castle, but whether the land could heal. Podrick Payne traveled onward, bound still by the quiet vow that had shaped his path since the day Brienne took him under her wing, to protect those who could not protect themselves. His new sword, Tyreek's old blade, hung at his side, reminding him that every stroke of steel carried the weight of duty and potential mercy. He might have shaped the fate of battles, but he took no pride in that. Instead, he felt a deep humility. War was a raging storm, and he had walked through it, carrying a single lantern of compassion against the darkness. That lantern still burned, and as he ventured into the unknown roads ahead, he resolved to keep its flame alive, no matter the cost. He made his way north, hearing that the Riverlands still struggled under remnants of old raiding bands, and that House Tully's seat at Riverrun had become a refuge for displaced families. Along the route, he passed quiet villages, visited humble septs for a night's rest, and on each stop, people recognized him. Whispers circulated, the knight of the people, the shield of the innocent. Tales grew in the telling. Some said he had slain Damon with one stroke, others that he had wrestled a lion barehanded. Podrick tried to correct them when he could, but legends took on a life of their own. He accepted it with a shy smile, as if it all belonged to someone else. One afternoon, crossing a stone bridge over the Tumblestone River, he encountered a small group of outlaws harassing a merchant's wagon. Without hesitation, Podrick rode toward them, calling out for them to stand down. They jeered, brandishing daggers and clubs. Perhaps they expected an easy mark. Then they saw the glint of steel at Podrick's hip, the calm determination in his eyes. After a brief scuffle, Podrick disarming two with quick strikes, the rest fled. The grateful merchant thanked Podrick profusely, offering him silver coins. Podrick refused more than a single coin for provisions, recalling Brienne's lessons never to profit from violence. He continued on his journey, leaving the merchant wide-eyed with gratitude. So it went across the roads of Westeros, Podrick intervening where he could, avoiding battles when possible, yet never hesitating to stand against cruelty. Each time he drew his sword, he remembered the battered septon who had knighted him, how that ceremony had been so humble, lacking pomp, yet so profound. He carried that sense of devotion every time he risked his life. If someone asked why he did it, he would only say, "It's my duty as a knight." He never claimed to be special, but others began to see him as a symbol of a better era, a kinder code, the echo of old ideals that had nearly drowned in the horrors of civil war. Eventually, word reached him of distant disturbances. Rebellious hill tribes near the Vale, a rumored invasion from the Iron Islands seeking to exploit weakened coasts, tension between newly established Targaryen claimants in the east. It felt as though peace was always just out of reach. He knew he couldn't face all these troubles alone, but each call for help drew him onward, a lone knight among chaos. Across many months, he left footprints and hoofprints in half the Seven Kingdoms, forging alliances with minor lords who valued justice, reuniting scattered families, thwarting pockets of bandits. His name, Ser Podrick Payne, became a quiet rallying cry for the powerless who prayed for a champion. Sometimes, in taverns or roadside inns, he would overhear travelers discuss him in hushed, awed tones, never suspecting that the man sipping watered wine nearby was the very hero they praised. Still, he bore scars both visible and hidden. In lonely moments, he recalled the terror of cavalry charges or the final confrontation with Damon. Nightmares visited him sometimes, full of screams and the stench of burning fields. In those dreams, he saw Brienne, tall and steadfast, urging him to keep going. He saw Tyrion, raising a wine cup in wry salute. He saw the face of the old mother he'd saved by the Mander, the children at her side. And always, he awoke with the same thought. One man can't change the world entire, but he can be a light in one corner of the night. So Podrick Payne rode on, a knight who refused to yield to cynicism, who had carved out a place in the war-torn tapestry of Westeros. He had risen from a shy squire who spilled wine to a swordsman whose prowess surprised war-hardened veterans, from a trembling boy to a champion who used skill not for vanity but to protect the weak. Though he walked among lords and ladies, he was of the people, one of them, a humble soul who had glimpsed the worst of men and still believed in the faint glimmer of goodness. In time, the battles he shaped and the lives he touched would pass into story and song, embroidered by minstrels. But the truest testament lay in the memories of those who survived because he had been there. Farmers who returned to their fields, children who grew to adulthood without the weight of a blade at their throat, entire villages that endured. If pressed to speak of his feats, Podrick would only shuffle his feet, cheeks reddening, and say, "I did what any knight should." So the realm moved on, and so did Podrick Payne, carrying his battered shield and his newly gifted sword, forging a legend that owed nothing to arrogance or cruelty, but everything to a vow once shared by a noble woman who had believed in him when no one else did. And in that quiet determination, in that unwavering devotion to protect and serve, he reshaped more than battles. He reshaped hearts, reminding Westeros that mercy and honor could still prevail, even in an age marred by war and shattered oaths. That, in the end, was the legacy of Sir Podrick Payne. A legacy that whispered across the roads and rivers of the Seven Kingdoms for years to come, echoing long after swords were sheathed and crowns were claimed or cast down. Through surprising skill and undimmed compassion, he had risen to knighthood and changed the fate of many battles. Yet the deepest change he wrought was the faint but vital reminder that in all the ruin war brings, a single knight with a good heart can still uphold the old ideals. And in so doing, he can hold the door against the night for just a little longer so that hope may enter.